Hello, everyone, and welcome to this follow-up stream on Belisarius, Byzantium's Africanus. And like last time, I'm very happy to be joined by the very wonderful and erudite Furius Pertinax.
Thank you, Mr. Bede. Lovely to be back. I do apologise. This stream is delayed because of me. We should have done this probably a few weeks ago, but here we are. And yes, we shall cover the Byzantium's Africanus, as you say. I do love the title, by the way. I think it's quite fitting now that I've pondered on it, Bede.
Yes, we discussed this last time, but yeah, I did a stream about 2 years ago with Todd Lewis, Praise of Folly, looking at Scipio Africanus, and obviously I always wanted to do a stream on Belisarius, and when I started reading him again, I couldn't help but see these comparisons, and I think it's quite novel because I don't think anyone else has really made this comparison before.
Indeed. And I was going to say, it's worth saying, I love your intro, by the way. It's like, it's short and concise, but punchy. It's an absolute banger.
Well, you can thank John Cinder for making that, so.
Indeed.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, so last time we looked at the kind of the earlier career of Belisarius, so looking at his origins as a bodyguard at the court of Justinian, then his first and proper military campaign in the east against the Persians, his role in the Nika riots, then the African War or the Vandalic War, his first triumph, and then yeah, sort of general assessment of his personality and character. And today we're going to get into probably the conflict that he's best known for, which is his involvement in the Gothic War, which is a delusion if you could ever describe a conflict as one. A sort of 20-year epic slogging match in Italy between the Goths and the Romans, and of course a second smaller war against the Persians in the Lazic War, and then a final little skirmish with some barbarians that tops off Belisarius' career. Any sort of other general assessment you want to make before we delve further?
One quick reflection I will make is that it is profoundly tragic that, given the scope of, I suppose, what you could call basically Justinian's ambition, that the campaign in North Africa, the Vandalic War, the Vandalic campaign in North Africa, you might say, even though it wasn't lavishly equipped, like it certainly wasn't built up in the same way that, say, Majorian's abortive campaign was, or some prior attempts to invade Africa, sort of between Majorian and Belisarius, were equipped. Essentially, you could say that the task force that was sent from Byzantium under Belisarius was no bigger than sort of the later campaign that was sent from Byzantium to Crete under Nicephorus Phocas to recover Crete. I dare say the forces were probably fairly comparable in size, but this is, rather than to take an island in the Mediterranean/Aegean, this is to conquer the better part of I suppose you could technically call, like, North Africa the subcontinent, but sort of up north rather than downward facing in the case of India. But it's it's not a tiny force, but it's not gargantuan either. And with a relatively modest number of troops, he obviously succeeds in his campaign. He had some luck, of course. We've covered that in the previous stream, but he also did it through superb generalship, very adept and capable subordinates, and a well-motivated army, and a relatively friendly populace, and discord amongst the Vandalic sort of elite, if you could call them that. And then Justinian's sort of next step is, and I mean, obviously we'll cover this, but firstly a landing on Sicily, and then that he's followed by then the attack on the mainland. And because they have to billet troops and garrison troops in North Africa, Belisarius has even less resources to undertake what would be, or what should have been, at least at face value, a more difficult campaign. Italy was the center of Ostrogothic power, as opposed to, say, Sicily, which was more peripheral province. And also Italy, I know the sources say that Italy was largely unfortified, but you'd imagine places such as, say, Taranto or Bari, which were centers of power even in sort of pre-Roman times, large settlements in, say, like the Magna Graecia period. you could not imagine they would have been completely denuded of defences. But in any case, let's even assume that Italy was largely undefended and unfortified when Belisarius landed. Italy was a place that, even though the Western Empire had quote unquote fallen, it was still a place, a locality that had, relatively large urban centres, a high degree of urbanization, considerable population centres. And Italy, the whole reason Rome adopts the Manipular Legion way back when in the Republican era is because Rome, with the Apennines and the Alps in the north, is hilly and mountainous, and it's logistically difficult. And as Rome knows from its own history, going all the way back to Samnite times, liable for ambushes and for being cut off from supply lines and logistical support. Belisarius obviously knows this, and so the fact that Justinian is sort of sending him into Italy, knowing all this, with a smaller force than what he had in Africa, keeping in mind also that the African troops rebel because they're underpaid on the brink of this invasion, makes Belisarius' accomplishments all the more remarkable. Sorry for the tangent, but a lot to squeeze in there.
Oh, no, it's wonderful. Thank you. And just before we delve in proper, I just want to address a couple of super chats I've had from a good old friend and channel member, Rongtail Wu. So $30. It's wonderful to have both of you and Marcus Backbead, and $5 again from Rongtail Wu. The Hydra is slain, sadly not for Belisarius, but for me it is. See everyone tomorrow at noon. Well, good to see you back, Rongtail Wu, after your long absence. Thank you again for your super chat.
Thank you, Mr. Rongtail. And
right.
I don't think we should probably highlight Iron Duke's comment for sake of crude. I was going to say when you put it up, but yes. You are correct, Iron Duke. Well, it's your channel, Beat. So I was going to say yes, you are correct, Iron Duke.
I mean, I think that word's not too bad. There's far worse things he could have said. Which,
I know. Yes, let's just say he was indeed betrayed by his wife of low moral standing.
Well, what happens when you marry a thought, eh?
Indeed, yes. The eternal sort of, what would you call him? How do you refer to it? As like a Romafoid? They never change their colours.
Anyway, wonderful.
Romafoid. Yes. All right. Shall we?
Yes, indeed. So, okay, how do we get into the Gothic War? Well, obviously, off the back of this very successful campaign in Africa, Justinian, I think, was looking to always have an excuse to reconquer Italy. And what's going on, like in Africa, there is instability amongst the Ostrogoths, because the Visigoths are in Spain. Because what's going on, obviously, they have their king, Theodoric the Great. However, after Theodoric dies, he doesn't have a son. He has a daughter called Amalasuntha, and she has a son called Athelric. And so Athelric is made the new king of the Ostrogoths, with her as regent. Unfortunately for her, Athelric falls under the influence of many of the other Gothic warriors and sort of courtiers, and he ends up dying during a bout of heavy drinking. And then this completely undermines Amalasuntha, because her entire position was predicated upon her son being the king. And so what she does is she then makes her cousin Theodahad her co-ruler to try and strengthen her position. And however, for her trouble, Theodahad murders her and then becomes the sole ruler. And then Justinian uses this as a pretext to then invade Italy, because he'd been maintaining a relatively reasonably good relationship with the Goths and Amalasuntha, because Theodoric had essentially presented the kingdom essentially as a kind of Byzantine Roman vassal, but in fact it was really an independent kingdom. But there was enough lip service there to placate, I think, the Roman attitude, if you know what I mean.
At the very least, we could consider it the Ostrogothic Italian kingdom as a sort of a cooperative semi-client state, because it's probably hard to describe them as a vassal, but
what I meant was that they're a vassal on paper, but in reality, not really.
Oh, 100%, and I agree. That's exactly why I said that. But also, it's worth taking note as well that let's not forget that if I'm not mistaken, it's the Ostrogoths themselves who send the Western Roman regalia to Constantinople in recognition that there is no Roman emperor in Rome anymore. So it's a strange little twist.
No, certainly. And there's actually
Was
very
that to Zeno?
interesting.
Was Zeno emperor in the East at the time? If memory serves me correct.
Um, I'm
I think it
sorry,
was.
I'm sorry, I thought you were talking about something during Justinian, but this is much earlier.
Yeah, when West Rome falls, when the
Mhm.
Brigalia are sent from Rome to Constantinople, I believe it's I want to say it's either Zeno or it's and
No, it would have been
Anastasius, but I
Zeno.
can't
Yeah,
remember. Yeah, it was
it
Zeno.
was
Yeah, it was
Zeno.
Zeno. Yeah. But in essence, I just made that reference to sort of for the sake of the audience to sort of portray the dynamic that exists between the Ostrogothic kingdom and the East Roman Empire.
Certainly, and so ultimately, the murder of the recognized kind of representative or leader of this not nominal vassal is the pretext Justinian needs. And there's a very interesting argument I've seen, Marcus, of Justinian's sort of deviousness.
Mm-hmm.
Argument I've seen, this was by John Julius Norwich in his books on Byzantium, that his argument was that Justinian and the Molosans were like sending these letters to each other. And
Mm-hmm.
he makes this argument that Amolosund, so if you read between the lines, was kind of trying to flirt with Justinian a bit. And his
Mm-hmm.
argument was that Theodora got jealous, and she is the
Mm-hmm.
one who persuades Theodora to murder Amolosund, which then gives
Wow.
Justinian the pretext to invade. Which I mean, that's incredibly cynical. But yeah,
I mean, incredibly cynical, but I mean, hard to put it past Theodora, right? If we're being completely honest.
no, exactly, no.
I mean, if
Mm.
she was nothing else, she was definitely what we might call, quote unquote, an operator of sorts.
No, absolutely.
The other
Yeah,
thing, sorry, just to mention briefly as well. Let's also keep in mind that at this point, this is obviously before the plague. Obviously, we'll touch on the plague when we get to it. But even sort of prior to the Vandalic campaign, Justinian actually is on something of a high. He has a lot of momentum, political momentum domestically after crushing the Nika riots. Even though the Persian War, which we did cover before the first Persian War, was sort of semi-inconclusive. Belisarius wins renown. There's peace in the empire. He's undertaken massive public works projects. They have then obviously had the victory in North Africa. So there's a great deal of optimism in Constantinople at this point of time.
no, exactly. So I guess it could explain the kind of the confidence and ambition in launching this grand Italian campaign. Unfortunately, it wouldn't go as smoothly as I think there's anticipated, because I would say these latter wars of Belisarius and the Gothic War and the Larsic War, they are much less decisive. There is a lot more kind of moving around, supplies, sieges, retreats, withdrawals, and there's less sort of big grand pitched battles. So it can obviously turn into a bit of a attritional slog. So that's one notable difference. But I guess it just shows Belisarius' talent, that he's able to operate in a very different style of warfare than what he was used to.
Indeed. Yeah. So do we want to actually touch on the capture of Sicily before we sort of get into Italy proper? What do you have in mind?
Well, as you see on this image, this is a kind of chronology of the first phase of the Gothic War. So Belisarius' sort of grand campaign over this 5-year period, from 535 to 540. So it all begins with him landing at Syracuse, and then he very quickly conquers and consolidates Sicily with little to no resistance. The only place that puts up a fight is Panormus and modern day Palermo, which he has to siege, but that's not too long. There's then a mutiny in Africa, which he has to then quickly run over and pacify before coming back. And it should also be noted that, like his campaign in Africa, he's accompanied by Procopius, who is obviously the main historian of Justinian's military campaigns, and also his aforementioned wife Antonina, and also his son-in-law, stepson Photius.
Indeed. I have a passage here. If you'd like me to just touch on the landing in Sicily.
Sure, go for it.
Because essentially, what was decided, or according to the sources here, what was decided that the landing in Sicily was to be undertaken, and the province pacified more or less, so long as there wasn't strong resistance, because it would have imperiled other parts of the campaign. Although Sicily was itself the springboard to Italy, and indeed, if Sicily had actually held with its relatively strong garrison, there's every possibility that perhaps the Italian campaign itself may have been aborted, may have been delayed. It may have played out differently or not at all. We don't really know these answers. But because the Goths gave up the island, with the exception of Panormus, and then Belisarius devised a very clever way to take Panormus, it sort of feeds into the optimism that was already there, and then leads to, ultimately, in my opinion, the decision to then land in Italy. But for some context, I'll read from sources here. So just to sort of finish that point as well. So in essence, the fact that the island was lightly defended did make it easy for Belisarius, and also ended up being the sort of impetus for Byzantine policy in accordance with administering the island. And I'll canvass that here if I may. For the proposed campaign, Belisarius was given fewer troops than for the African campaign. First among his troops listed by Procopius, 4,000 soldiers from the regular troops of the Federati, which is numbered at around 4,000. The cavalry were led by Valentinus, Magnus Innocentius, the infantry by Herodian, Paulus, Demetrius, and Urskinius. Above these, and serving directly under Belisarius, were Constantinus, Bessus, and Pertanius. Belisarius was further allocated 3,000 Isaurians under Enes, or otherwise known as Ignatius, and that's important later, because he actually does particularly couple of famous things in Italy, but we'll touch on that after. He also was accompanied by 300 Moorish and 200 Hunnic allied troops. Lastly, he was accompanied by the traditional Comitatus of Bucalari, which are his bodyguard, which numbers at 7,000. That's not actually counting his own personal bodyguard per se. Belisarius was given sole command of the expedition, retained his rank of Magister Militum per Orientum, which is kind of ironic because he's in the West at this point in time, but anyway, and was accompanied on a campaign by his stepson Photius, the son of Antonina by previous marriage. Sorry about this. So with fewer troops than those given for the invasion of Africa, Belisarius was ordered to land in Sicily. However, Justinian was not prepared to fight a long, protracted war for the island. His instructions were to land on Sicily whilst declaring that he was heading for Carthage. Once on the island, he was to test the mood of the islanders. If they were lords of the Goths, he was to sail on. If they were prone to accept imperial rule, he was to attempt to take the island. The reasons behind the strategy are simple. There were simply not enough troops available at such short notice to enable a full-scale campaign against the Goths, of the sort that had been mounted against the Vandals. It is probable that during this stopover in Sicily on the way to Africa, Belisarius had noticed that there were extremely few Gothic troops stationed on the island beyond the capital. Therefore, Belisarius was given what was available in order to test the islanders' loyalty, whilst they were unguarded and before the Goths could send large-scale reinforcements from the mainland. The strategy was a risk, but only a small one. At the first sign of resistance, Belisarius could cut his losses, sail into Africa without appearing to have suffered defeat. So there you go. Actually, do you want me to touch on the siege of Panormus just briefly? Because it's actually quite ingenious how they capture it.
Mm-hmm. Sure, go for it, yeah.
The town... hang on. Here we go. Of course, here we are. It was ordered that at all times the Sicilian natives were to be treated with respect, ensuring their support for the invasion in the return to the imperial fold, as it happened in Africa. Belisarius landed in Sicily, close to the town of Catana, which is modern-day Catania on the west coast. If you look at this map here, you see the dot of, Rhegium is on the mainland, but that's across the harbour from Messina. But if you consider that's Messina, and then that southern town, or the southern city of Syracuse, Catania is about halfway. Just under the number 6 there, you'll see a sort of a topographical sort of elevation there. That's Mount Etna. Catana's right on the foot of Mount Etna on the coastline, so that's kind of where the expedition landed. Back to the source. Landed close to the town of Catana. The town immediately surrendered to him, a capitulation that was mirrored by all the other towns and cities on the island with the exception for Panormus. This was the only town mentioned by Procopius as having a Gothic garrison prior to their surrender. If the towns were undefended, their surrender was understandable. At Panormus, the Gothic garrison refused to surrender, since the walls appeared to be maintained and indeed strengthened, and they believed that Belisarius did not have sufficient forces to take the city by storm, a belief which Belisarius himself had shared. However, Belisarius had observed that the city walls did not surround the harbour. He therefore ordered his ships to sail into the harbour, where there was only comparatively a low wall. Once inside the harbour, it was realised that the masts of the ships were taller than the walls. Belisarius ordered small boats to be hoisted up to the heights of small boats to be hoisted up to the top of the masts, where the boats were loaded with archers. They overlooked the city, and the archers were able to fire down upon the defenders of the main walls. Filled with fear of this development and shocked by surprise, the Goths quickly surrendered.
Oh, thank you for reading that. And something I'm very intrigued by is obviously you were speaking at this idea that Belisarius, the goal was, let's land and let's test the waters a bit, and if they're not loyal, we'll just take over. And so I think it speaks to a kind of great sort of opportunism on Justinian's part, where I think perhaps the Renovatio Imperii wasn't necessarily some grand strategy or project of his, but rather it was simply a policy of, I'm going to use whatever opportunistic means I can to reclaim provinces. So, we'll test the waters here, we'll prod there, and if there's weakness, then we'll just take it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was going to say, to sort of borrow lexicon from sort of like an economic or financial standpoint, it's sort of a minimal risk, maximal return kind of strategy. The idea that if the island just simply folds and capitulates, boom, the entire island is under imperial command. Whereas if the Goths so much as levy anything more than a warband, a small warband against the landing force, and they'll cut and run to Africa, therefore not imperiling in a single life of a soldier in the army, you can't really get a lot more. But perhaps caution's not the right word, but certainly a reservedness regarding, as per the sources says that Justinian did not want to get involved essentially in a slugging contest for Sicily, and that's which is kind of ironic because of what happens in Italy later. But certainly at the beginning of the campaign, there is this sort of tentativeness about not getting caught up and bogged down in some kind of attritional, drawn out campaign.
I know, if anything, I would say I essentially see the taking of Sicily as kind of a bargaining chip, because then Theodahad tries to negotiate with Justinian. Essentially, there's a tentative agreement where Justinian says, "Okay, I'll recognise you as king of Italy if you formally cede Sicily to me." And so essentially, it's like a bargaining chip. But then what's interesting is Theodahad. There's even, according to Procopius, Theodahad is almost agrees to essentially handing over all of it in exchange for being given a large estate. So essentially completely sell out and betray his own people for this. However, what happens is over up here in Dalmatia, another Roman commander, Mundus, occupies Dalmatia. But when a Gothic counterattack kills Mundus, and Theodahad completely about faces on this promise to exchange Italy, and then he digs his heels in and calls off this arrangement. And so this then forces Belisarius to push further into the Italian mainland to bring the Goths to heel.
I was going to say not to get sort of bogged down too much into details. Sorry, I just need to go back to my source here. Okay, here we go. Regarding Dalmatia, it's kind of interesting how it plays out, because what actually happens is that the Goths. So Mundus is sent initially to Dalmatia. He succeeds in his capture of Salona. But whilst Mundus is pushing on towards Italy, his son is actually left in command of the garrison of Salona. And when the Goths counterattack, they bypass where Mundus's position is. They attack the city, and in defense of the city, Mundus's son, Mauricius, or Morris, I suppose, who was on a reconnaissance mission, was killed in a skirmish. And so Mundus sort of backtracks to the city with the main part of the force, defeats the Gothic main army outside the walls of Salona, but he himself, although he doesn't die in battle, he's mortally wounded. So this first attack by land that Justinian dispatches basically falls into disarray. The army itself remains intact; it's just leaderless. So which then leads to events. The news reaches Constantinople, and so Justinian sends another commander, one Constantinianus, who is his, I think he's what do you call it, the captain of horse, basically, the magister militum, but of cavalry, to recover Dalmatia with additional reinforcements. So this is the position in which that contingent finds itself in the Balkans, and that's basically the fate of Bundus, who we touched on earlier, was one of the generals who led the or who saved Justinian during the Nika riots.
I just comment from Iron Duke. Remember the Arch Robertsons who lead your enemy away to retreat.
Indeed.
And because just to go back to Theodahad, obviously not only turned on this perceived arrangement with Justinian, he actually detains the Roman ambassadors. So you can imagine Justinian not being too happy about that. And so, Belisarius is then given orders to invade the mainland, and the main kind of battle we have here is the siege of Neapolis, or modern Naples, and this is somewhat more of an involved encounter than the siege of Panormus that had been. And when Belisarius gets there, he actually tries to negotiate the surrender of the city. And there's actually a reading I want to do from Procopius. So, yes, this is an exchange from Stephanus, who is the leader of the. Hang on. Yeah, so the Neapolitans send Stephanus to negotiate on their behalf with Belisarius. So, this is Stephanus. You are not acting justly, O general, in marching against men who are Romans and have done no wrong, who inhabit a small city and have a garrison of barbarian masters, so that it is not even in our power, if we desire to do so, to oppose them. But it so happens that even these guards had to leave their wives, children, and most precious possessions in the hands of Theodahad before they came to keep guard over us. Therefore, if they treat with you at all, they will be betraying not the city but themselves. If one must speak the truth with no disguise, you have not deliberated to your advantage either in coming against us, or if you capture Rome, Naples will be subject to you without any further trouble, whereas if you are repulsed from there, it is likely that you will not be able to hold even this city securely. Consequently, the time you spend on the siege will be wasted for no purpose. So spoke Stephanus. Belisarius replied as follows: Whether we acted wisely or not in deciding to come here is not a question we intend to put before the Neapolitans, but we desire that you consider carefully such matters as are appropriate to your deliberations, and then act in accordance with your own interests. Receive the Emperor's army into your city, which has come to secure your freedom and that of the other Italians, and do not choose what will bring upon you the most grievous misfortunes. For those who go to war in order to rid themselves of slavery or any other shameful thing have a double good fortune if they fare well in the struggle, because along with their victory they've also acquired freedom from oppression, while if defeated they have some consolation for themselves, in that they have not of their own free will chosen to follow the worst fortune. But as for those who have the opportunity to be free without fighting but enter into a struggle in order to make their condition of slavery permanent, such men have failed in the most vital point, even if so happens that they prevail, and if in battle they fare less happily than they wished, they will have, along with their general ill fortune, also the calamity of defeat. As for the Neapolitans, then, let these words of ours suffice. But as for the Goths who are present, we give them a choice, either to array themselves hereafter on our side under the great emperor, or go to their homes entirely free from harm. Because if both you and they disregard all these considerations and dare to raise arms against us, it will be necessary for us also, if God so wills, to treat whomever we meet as an enemy. If, however, it is of the will of the Neapolitans to choose the course of the emperor, and thus be rid of so cruel a slavery, I'll take it upon myself, giving you pledges to promise that you will receive at our hands the treatment that the Sicilians lately hoped for, and about which they were unable to say that we had sworn falsely. So essentially what he's doing there is Belisarius is trying to divide the Neapolitans, who obviously are of Greek ancestry, from the Goths, who are obviously these Germanic barbarians, saying, you've got more in common with us, the Romans, because remember, the Eastern Empire, though Belisarius was a Latin, many of the soldiers that weren't of barbaric origin, such as the Huns, would have been Greeks, and obviously Neapolis is part of Magna Graecia or Greater Greece. So again, there's a kind of like an ethno kind of ethnic ties, so to speak, and I think that's what Belisarius is trying to lean on to get them to surrender, saying, if you don't fight against us, then you won't be harmed. As long as you throw the Goths under the bus, you won't face any trouble, essentially.
Exactly. I can expand upon that if you'd like me to, regarding Naples.
Sure, go for it.
So, 3 of the envoys are named by Procopius. Stephanus, who you obviously mentioned and quoted from Procopius, appears to have been in favour of surrender to the Byzantines, especially when Belisarius promised him a large reward if he could convince the Neapolitans to surrender without a fight. Pastor and Asclepiodotus were friendly with the Goths and argued that the city should remain loyal to Theodahad. So again, this touches on that divergence between the Goths and the garrison, and then the population of Naples, who obviously had sort of cultural and ethnic ties, and also an administrative connection to the emperor in Constantinople. Following the advice of Pastor and Asclepiodotus, the citizens sent large lists of demands to Belisarius. Only after he had agreed to them would the city surrender. No doubt the Gothic sympathizers believed that he would never agree to them. When Belisarius agreed to all the points, the citizens were about to accede to his request when Pastor and Asclepiodotus reminded them that what would be in store for the city if they surrendered to the Byzantines, but the Goths were ultimately victorious. The citizens thus refused to surrender, and the siege began. Should I continue on to the siege?
Very quickly, we've had another super chat from Richard Hughes for £30, being looking forward to the stream for ages. Thank you for both showing your knowledge. Well, thank you so much for your super chatter, Richard Hughes. It is very much appreciated. Carry on,
Indeed.
Marcus.
Thank you, Richard. Indeed. Okay, 2 seconds. Here we are. During the course of the siege, Belisarius lost many men in fruitless and costly assaults, and although he cut the aqueduct leading to the city, the inhabitants were able to survive on water from wells and cisterns within the city walls. They also succeeded in sending a message to Theodahad asking for aid. Part of Belisarius' strategy had been to take Rome before the winter set in, and as the siege extended, he began to make plans to lift the siege and advance on the ancient imperial capital. At this point, he would have a stroke of luck. An Isaurian who wanted to take a look at the workmanship of the ancients. An Isaurian had wanted to look at the workmanship of the ancients, and so had wandered to the now dry aqueduct. He quickly realized that with little work, a section of the aqueduct that was almost blocked by natural rock formation could be widened, and so permit secret entry into the city. When informed of this, Belisarius sent workmen to complete the task as described, and when the preparations had been made, he gave the Neapolitans one last chance to surrender before the city was put to the sack. Stephanus carried this message, but the citizens had refused to believe him. Accordingly, Belisarius had sent 400 men through the aqueduct, led by Enes, the Isaurian leader, and Magnus, accompanied by 2 trumpeters and a large quantity of torches. In the dark, 200 of these men had lost their nerve and returned with Magnus to Belisarius. Belisarius chose 200 replacements, and gathering their courage, the 200 who had previously fled also returned to the aqueduct, and so 600 men now made their way into Naples. In order to distract the guards from any noise the troops made in the in order to distract the guards on the walls from any noise that the troops in the aqueduct might make, Belisarius had Bessus converse with those nearest to the aqueduct in Gothic, urging them to yield and gain larger rewards. Amidst the jeers of the guards, 600 men advanced unnoticed into the city. After 3/4 of the night had passed, the invasion party finally emerged from the aqueduct. They seized 2 towers on the northern wall in quick succession, opposite Belisarius' position. Blowing their trumpets and lighting the torches, Belisarius ordered an immediate assault with attacks on all sides of the walls in order to pin down the defenders and to stop them from sending reinforcements to the northern wall breach. Finally, the gates were opened and the city was sacked. The women and children being taken as slaves, and the soldiers acquiring vast amounts of booty. After the initial frenzy, Belisarius was able to gradually restore order. He commanded after that the women and children be returned to their families in order to cultivate goodwill with the citizens. However, the booty was declared as a prize of war, and the soldiers were allowed to keep it as a punishment to the citizens for failing to surrender. Due to the stress of the siege, the Neapolitan envoy Pastor died of natural causes, but Asclepiodotus was killed by the citizens for giving advice that allowed the city to be sacked.
A bit of an unfortunate turn of events there, but again, I think it just shows Belisarius' merciful nature, because he realizes, it's not a good look if I just let all these foreign barbarians just go around looting and having their way with the women. So that's why he does step in and compromise and say, listen, I don't think we should massacre all the women and children, but he has to accept that you have to let the soldiers get some booty. Otherwise, what's the point in being a soldier if you're not going to get paid or get booty?
And keep in mind too that at this point in time, only the very eldest of people alive at this point would have been born when the empire was still intact. And you have the era right at the end between Orestes, Julius Nepos, Romulus Augustulus before the deposition. But these people who populate Italy are at the very least the children and great-grandchildren of Roman citizens. So, and also Italy being the birthplace of what was the Republic of yesteryear, has become the empire. Its capital may be in Constantinople, but this is still technically the actual heartland of what was the Roman Empire. So it's a very interesting dynamic at play here.
Exactly. Again, it's all of Belisarius is presenting, we are restoring order to these wayward provinces. These stewards who were trusted the Goths are infighting and defying the rightful emperor.
Absolutely, indeed.
And so after securing Naples, Belisarius obviously pushes north onwards towards Rome. And what's interesting with Rome is that the Goths essentially abandoned Rome and just let him walk in and take it, essentially, which is incredible how easily they just allow him to do this. Although I should also note that after Naples was captured, the Goths actually deposed Theodahad, and Witigis becomes the new Gothic king. And the main reason is that Theodahad was seen as too passive. He didn't try to relieve Naples. He didn't try to counterattack. He just kind of sat back and hoped the city would just be able to resist. And so passivity leads to his downfall there. So Witigis, when he comes in...
I have a paragraph here if you want me to discuss it.
Sure, go.
Sorry, pardon me. Hearing of the circumstances surrounding the loss of Naples, the Goths turned against Theodahad, since he had done nothing to send aid to the city and was deemed too passive in the face of Roman invasion. Meeting near Tarracina, which is modern-day Terracina, and if you look at this map here, is approximately halfway between Ostia and Naples on the coastline. If you look at where the letter C is in Campania on this map, basically the bottom of the sea there is where Terracina is. Meeting at Terracina, or Tarracina as it was, they elected Witigis as leader of the Goths. Theodahad fled towards Ravenna, but a Goth named Optaris was sent by Witigis to bring him back dead or alive. Optaris decided upon the former solution. He caught up with Theodahad and his small retinue before he could reach Ravenna and killed him. The Goths now had a new energetic leader, and thus they prepared for war.
Certainly, and I think this is where I would say the Gothic War begins proper, because Witigis would prosecute the Gothic offensive much more successfully than Theodahad had. And again, I've mentioned this surrender of Rome. It's important to note that in the absence of the Goths, it's actually the Pope Silverius who surrenders the city. And after seeing what happened to Naples, he didn't want to repeat of that, and so I think he very wisely surrenders without a fight to Belisarius. And and so the next sort of year or 2 years is essentially a bit of a slogging match where the Goths are throwing everything they can at Rome, trying to retake the city back, essentially.
Exactly, and just as a note too, let's keep in mind that even though Rome has suffered damage throughout the course of the 5th century, and obviously here we're talking like the first half of the 6th century, Rome at this point still has a relatively high population. It's understood and probably understandable that it wasn't at the height it was during sort of the imperial zenith of the empire. It would be doubtful that Rome would still have a population of anywhere from 1 to 2 million people, as it did say during the reign of the 5 good emperors, or in the days of the early republic post Augustus. And certainly probably would have had a similar population even up until perhaps Aurelian or Constantine's time. We don't know exactly, but let's just assume that for a moment. But it is entirely likely that Rome quite easily would have had a population. And I apologize, I haven't actually looked into this, but I would just sort of, if I was to make a punt, I would say that it'd have to be somewhere sort of around under 1 million. I would probably suggest somewhere between maybe 600,000 and 800,000, maybe a bit less, perhaps 500,000, but still a very, very large city. I mean, at this point in time, it would still be one of the largest cities in the world, and I don't think Constantinople had quite grown to that size yet. So it's very likely that Rome was probably still the largest city in the Mediterranean, if not, up there with, say, Carthage, Alexandria, probably above those, perhaps on par with Antioch, maybe above that. And it could have still been possibly larger than Constantinople, but it was still a very, very sizable and important city. Rome depopulates after this period, though, for reasons that we'll canvass later in the stream. But just to gain some perspective as to what Rome was like at this time.
I will push back slightly because, and I've just quickly done a quick Google search to verify this, but no, Rome's population had significantly declined. So by the time of 500 AD,
oh, okay.
it was only 100,000. So I mean, it's still a large city for this time, but it's
so
really
okay. So a lot of the population had shed. Well, I mean, I assumed that a lot had shed, but I didn't realize it was that much. Anyway, thank you for the correction. It's good to know.
Yeah, I mean, that's still a large city for this time, but obviously that's a far cry from where she had been. And sadly, it's actually the Gothic War that leads to a further decline, because I think after the end of the conflict, I think it's something like 10,000 or less.
Yeah, I think up until like the 7th century, there's still it's still in the tens of thousands of people. But by the time you sort of get to, I hate to use the word, but by the time you sort of get to like the end of the Dark Ages and the emergence of the medieval period, Rome is no larger in population terms than Paris or London. Like, it's literally about 10,000, maybe 12 or 15,000 people. It's a fraction of the city it once was.
Shameful fate for such an illustrious city.
Indeed. Just to touch on Vitiges, should we sort of touch on the siege at least a little bit, or what do you have in mind?
Oh no, certainly. I mean, I would say this is really the set piece of the first phase of the Gothic War, or these endless sieges of Rome by the Goths. And I've actually got a map here of Rome during this period. So one of the main problems with the siege is that a lot of the defenses are crumbling, and so Belisarius obviously tries to shore up and repair what's there, but with these repeated sieges, obviously there's more damage done, and then he has to keep improvising and repairing stuff again.
Indeed. Well, that is worth mentioning that compared to, say, what would otherwise have been the case, because let's keep in mind these are the Aurelian walls, and these were obviously built by the Emperor Aurelian during the time of the crisis of the 3rd century. So these walls, I mean, it's still old, I suppose, by how we would appreciate time in our modern context, but these walls were still only 200 or so years old and were still relatively relevant from a technological standpoint. And in fact, if you go to Rome today, like, there's still large parts of the Aurelian walls still there, and actually quite an impressive structure. But nonetheless, just because of what had occurred in Italy with the collapse of the Western Empire and the collapse of the institutions of Rome, the walls weren't in as good condition as they otherwise would have been. But suffice to say that once he actually enters the city, Byzantine engineers do actually strengthen the walls, and they do mostly bring them up to standard. Because even the defense of Naples, it says here in the sources that the defense of Naples were in good order, and similar is true for Rome. Although being a larger city, it was harder to maintain fortifications of this extent to the quality of the walls which they were. But nonetheless, when the cities are reoccupied by Belisarius and his army, improvements are made, and knowing that a siege is about to happen, they do what they can with what they have in order to strengthen the fortifications and bring them back up to standard.
Certainly, and there's been a comment by Richard Hughes. The Roman Empire had been devastated by a number of pestilences and at least one plague of locusts. So, oh dear, that doesn't sound very good. I mean, obviously, you mentioned I did a stream recently on the 5 Good Emperors. Well, that was actually, to my knowledge, that was actually the first time that there was a major plague in the Roman Empire. There was the Antonine Plague, and then later, of course, during this period, you've got the plague of Justinian, which is absolutely devastating. I think it was something like a quarter of the population died.
arguably more. Yeah, and probably I was going to say the two worst plagues, because I know the plague during the reign of Lucius Varus and Marcus Aurelius was fairly bad, but arguably the one that followed during the crisis of the 3rd century under Decius was probably worse. One would argue probably a lot worse, and that the plague suffered during the Justinian period was worse than that. I mean, we'll get to that because it hasn't occurred yet in our chronology, but indeed, Richard is quite right. At this point, there'd been at least 2 or 3 large-scale pestilences during the last couple of centuries, so they would have enacted a toll on the empire and its population, and indeed its institutions as a result.
But again, it's relevant to the decline of Rome in terms of its population, because again, during these various sieges, there's outbreaks of famine because obviously there's no food that's coming in. This disease, that is what contributes ultimately to the decline of Rome's population even more, other than just the wider cities of the empire as a whole. And obviously all this death means there's less recruits for the army, and so it leads to in the Gothic War, instead of having these epic battles where it's tens of thousands of men versus tens of thousands of men, it's more like a few thousand versus a few thousand. It's more like a battle in like the medieval period more than anything.
Indeed. Would you like me to just touch on the layout for the siege, since we're here?
Sure. Yeah, sure.
Procopius claims that during the siege of Rome, Vitiges led 150,000 men to assault the city. This is an extremely large number of men for the Goths in Italy to have available, and for the time frame. The suspicion that it is an exaggeration is inadvertently supported by Procopius himself when he states that even with 150,000 men, the Goths did not have enough troops to completely besiege the city. Out of 14 large gates, they only had enough troops to put pressure on 5 gates, mostly along the eastern walls, northern and eastern walls. With 150,000 men, they should have been able to enclose the whole city wall, which is less than 15 miles long, with an average of 10,000 men per mile. So I actually agree with that assessment personally, that it's a gross exaggeration by Procopius. Since Procopius's figures have been found to be unreliable, we must turn to conjecture. Roybos in Justinian's Wars from 1993 states that the highest figure likely for the Gothic army would be around 40,000 men, but this would shrink due to the poorer members of the Goths losing their Gothic status and having become assimilated with native Italians in the preceding decades. He also notes that the number of troops available for field actions would have been further diminished by the need to maintain garrisons at strategic points across Italy. It's indeed possible that he may have had 40,000 men at the siege of Rome, and then the rest of Italy, or parts of, for example, places such as Mediolanum or Ravenna would be garrisoned. But even then, we're still talking somewhere between a total Gothic military strength of somewhere between, say, 40 and 60,000. I can't imagine it being much more, but that's just my own opinion. It is probable that Boss's estimates are near to the reality. First, he figures. Sorry, that's probably not particularly relevant. This would be hang on. Oh yeah, it is probable that Boss's estimates are near to the reality. First, his figures make sense when we are told that Vitiges left a garrison of 4,000 men under Ludurus in Rome, and this obviously occurred afterwards. This would be a reasonable number of troops to defend Rome, given the size of the city and the significance of its significance both morally and strategically, and given the size of its fortifications. It is also a significant proportion of the overall available forces which he was forced to leave behind. Any less in the city would be indefensible. Any more in his own forces would have been seriously weakened as a field army. Furthermore, despite Belisarius having invaded with only around 15,000 men, he had no difficulty in establishing control of Sicily and southern Italy prior to his march on Rome. After Belisarius had left garrisons in the south, Vitiges was to realize that Belisarius had only a relatively small force in Rome and hurried to attack him whilst he was heavily outnumbered. So, what do you think of that, Bede?
No, certainly, and I think the concept, Vitiges' strategy was essentially he knew he outnumbered Belisarius quite significantly, so his plan was to do a long, drawn-out siege where he could sort of sap the manpower and supplies, and Belisarius is able to hold the city through a couple of sort of ingenious sort of little tactics of his. So one is he puts a chain over the Tiber to prevent the Goths from like sailing up into the city like Viking style. So that was
Yeah.
good. Another thing he does is that when the Goths try to get a breach of like their siege towers or rams, they're being pulled by oxen. And so Belisarius has his men hold fire until the oxen are almost at point blank range, and then open fires and killing the oxen, meaning that the equipment can't be dragged up to the walls. So that's another good little strategy. Another one as well is that when the Goths actually breach one of the gates, it is the Vivarium gate. He actually pulls his men back into reserve in like some tight alleys, so that when the Goths port through, they then jump on them at close quarters and completely cut them down, and the force of the counterattack forces them to pull back.
Indeed. Another, because you mentioned about the chain over the river, another thing that he resorted to is because Rome being the kind of city it was prior to its depopulation, obviously, we know to what degree, certainly early imperial times, to what degree the Romans relied on bread, both for actual nutrition and also for degrees of pacification of the population. And so there was actually quite sizable infrastructure to facilitate milling of bread and the storage of grain and production of bread, this sort of thing. But to sort of add to the fact that he had soldiers guarding the walls and there was an active battle occurring, and there was obviously a demand to both feed the population to keep them on side and to feed his army, which were garrisoning in the city and fighting against the Goths. Belisarius devises a way to actually mooring what you might even call like floating mills on the Tiber, and you see there's a portion of the walls here where it says on the map Via Aurelia that sits up, and the Porta Aurelia, which sit to the west of the Tiber River. That entire stretch of the river that is defended, which actually sits around the modern day sort of island of Travestere, they have mills that use the flow of the river from the hinterland to the sea to act as like floating milling. What would you call them? Like milling wheels, basically. And so, and also because generally speaking, on land they require oxen or donkeys to power, which they didn't have spare. So this is how they actually maintain. They got all this grain in storage, but they couldn't make it into flour. And this is how Belisarius gets it, makes it into flour to feed the population and his soldiers. And the other thing is to actually bring. He doesn't do this initially, but sort of later in the siege, when there's a degree of anxiety building in the city, when they see the size of the Gothic army, and Belisarius only has, you might even estimate, maybe anywhere from sort of 12 at most to as few as 7,000 or 8,000 men defending the city under arms. He actually has the fighting age population, or parts of the fighting age population, recruit into the army with salary, to stop them being what do you call it? Like when you're engaged, like when you're inactive, when you're not busy, when you're not the whole like devil idle hands thing, to keep the fighting age men from being restless in the city and causing anxiety. He actually recruits them into the army, basically creating essentially a militia within the city to bolster his soldiers, which he then, with the additional men who do join his forces, is able to actually defend almost man for man, or not man for man, but in terms of the length of the fortifications, he's able to not neglect whole sections of the wall. It offers reinforcement to his own soldiers and also allows him to use more elite formations, particularly his Bucellari, the allied Moors and Huns and Herulians who fight on horseback. And indeed, one of the tactics he actually uses in sort of the back and forth during the siege is he sallies out with his heavy cavalry and his cavalry archers, and wherever the Goths are encamped around the north and eastern parts of the wall, basically from the northern part of the Tiber here on this map all the way down to the Caelian Hill, to the, where as you see on this map here, there's a 5th Gothic camp right there on the easternmost part of the map. They sally out with these cavalry formations and shoot arrows into the Gothic formations, and the heavy cavalry will sort of strike with sudden charges against Gothic infantry formations and pull back into the city. He does this a number of times, often with great effect. And this does frustrate the siege for the Goths considerably.
Oh no, but what he also does is he uses it to lure the Gothic cavalry into isolated bands, and he then sort of sicks on them and wipes them out that way as well. So it's very good
Exactly.
use of the defeat in detail. And
Exactly.
also
Yeah,
it should be noted with the manpower imbalance, Belisarius around this time does send a letter to Justinian requesting more provisions and men. And there's just a letter I want to read from Procopius. So Belisarius then wrote a letter to the emperor and said the following: "We have arrived in Italy as you've commanded, and we have acquired much of its territory and hold Rome also, after expelling the barbarians in it, whose leader, Luderius, I've recently sent to you. But as we have stationed a great number of soldiers in both Sicily and Italy to guard the strongholds, which we prevailed in capturing, our army has in consequence been reduced to only 5,000, but the enemy have come against us, gathered together to the number of 150,000. Well, he's somewhat exaggerating there, but yeah, they were still significantly outnumbered. When we first went to spy upon their men along the Tiber River and were compelled, contrary to our intention, to engage with them, we came close to being buried under their multitude of spears. After this, when the barbarians attacked the wall with their whole army and assaulted the fortifications at every point with various engines of war, they again came close to capturing both us and the city at the first charge, and would have succeeded had not some chance snatched us from ruin. For outcomes that surpass the nature of things should not properly be ascribed to human virtue, but to a higher power. Now, all that has been achieved by us so far, whether due to chance or virtue, is for the best, but as to our prospects from now on, I could wish better things for your cause. However, I'll never hide from you anything that it is my duty to say and yours to do, knowing that while human affairs follow whatever course is set by God's will, those who are in charge of any enterprise always win praise or blame according to their own deeds. Therefore, let both arms and soldiers be sent to us in such numbers that from now on we may engage with the enemy in this war with an equality of strength. For one should not entrust everything to chance, as chance tends to not follow the same course forever. As for you, Emperor, take this thought to heart, that if at this time the barbarians prevail over us, we will be expelled from Italy, which is yours, and we will lose the army in addition, and besides all this, we will have a great shame stemming from our conduct. I refrain from saying that we should also be regarded as having ruined the Romans, men who have valued their safety less than their loyalty to your rule. Consequently, the result for us will be that the successes we have won so far will be in the end proved to have been but a prelude to disasters. For if it has so happened that we have been repulsed from Rome and Campania, or a much earlier time from Sicily, we would be feeling the sting only of the lightest of all misfortunes, namely being unable to grow wealthy on the possessions of others. Again, this too is worthy of consideration by you, that it has never been possible, even for many times 10,000 men to guard Rome, but a considerable length of time, as the city embraces a large territory, and because it was not on the sea, is shut off from all supplies. Although the Romans are well disposed towards us now, when their troubles are prolonged, as likely to happen, they will not hesitate to choose the course that it is in their own interests. But when men have entered into friendship, and with others on the spur of the moment, they tend to keep faith with them not in adversity, but while they prosper. Besides, the Romans will be compelled by hunger to do many things they would prefer not to do. As for me, I know I am bound even to die for your sake, and for this reason, no man will ever be able to expel me from the city while I live. But consider what kind of reputation such an Emperor Belisarius would bring to you. So essentially, send me more men and equipment, because if you don't, there's a risk that me, despite all my efforts, I won't be able to maintain the defences against the Gothic onslaught, and then it won't look very good if the Goths just counterattack and undo all the great work we've done thus far in this campaign. So again, I think this is a valid critique of Justinian. He I think tries to do everything on the cheap, and this ultimately undermines, I think, some of his the success of the Renovatio Imperii, if you like. You know, if you want to win, you need to invest the men and resources to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's demonstrative also that in warfare, and I don't want to get sort of like too much into nuts and bolts of military theory, but there are times where economizing troops and, you know, urging degrees of caution or, you know, being opportunistic here or there makes sense. You know, the old adage, the old sort of Sun Tzu adage is true, is that, you know, if you ultimately if you send reinforcements everywhere, you're everywhere weak. And ultimately, a sacrifice in one place makes the line weaker, and sending reinforcements in too many places doesn't allow you to achieve sufficient strength in any place. You know, there's all that to consider. But ultimately, over the course of an entire military operation or an entire campaign, it does ultimately need to be resourced properly. And I think the great tragedy is for all the opportunistic sort of sniping of territories, you know, whether it's the Vandelli campaign, the seizure of Sicily, the capture of Naples, the initial capture of Rome, but you can't prosecute an entire war, especially a grand strategy on that basis. It just simply doesn't work. Actually, not to diverge too much from away from this particular topic, but I just so happened to listen to something by John Mersheimer, this being 2026, mind you, mid 2026 when this stream goes live, sort of about the difference between some attritional warfare and blitz warfare and this sort of stuff. And it's kind of amazing how in a strange way, you look at someone like Caesar, who was able to sort of, you know, march fast, be decisive, you know, bring to heel entire provinces, and in the case of Gaul, like an entire, you know, nation of tribes, and incorporate them into Rome. And you can do that to a part piecemeal, but ultimately you need to build troops, you need to garrison areas, you need to pacify. There needs to be a policy of integration and yada yada yada. And as if, despite the fact that obviously Justinian is, you know, an intelligent man, and I would presume an erudite and well-read man, and the same of Belisarius and his scribe Procopius, and the fact there was a number of adept subordinates that, you know, fight with them, and of course Narses comes into the picture later, who's obviously would himself be a highly intelligent man as well, being a favorite in Constantinople, mind you. That there's this lack of foresight, and what is a chronically underfunded, undersupported war ends up being the ruination of Italy itself, and actually compromises the prospects of the campaign. And I think we sort of see that as this topic, as we get further and further into this topic, we talk more and more about the war. We can see it becomes very evident how the under-resourcing of this war becomes its own worst enemy.
And just to, obviously, the stream's title is Byzantium's Africanus, but this is a interesting parallel because obviously Scipio, after the success of his Spanish campaign, is planning his African campaign, and yet he's given almost no resources to do so by the Roman Senate. He's made the proconsul of Sicily, and he uses Sicily as the springboard for Africa. And what Scipio has to do is he has to train all of these troops at his own expense from the local province. So, and it's just incredible what Scipio is able to achieve with so few resources. But and again, same with Belisarius. Again, he's having to rely on the population of Rome and what he's already been given by Justinian, and he's having to beg for more men. You know, but again with Scipio, it was more that he had rivals in the Senate. It was people like Cato the Elder, who particularly did not like Scipio.
Indeed.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, so in terms of moving on through the course of the siege, after this point, there's actually a major engagement because. Hang on. That's it. So Belisarius does send out one of these cavalry. Sorry, yeah.
Oh no! You went exactly what I was going to touch on. You go first.
Yeah. So the Goths at this point try to do their own sort of
bridge.
Well, before then, because there was an allusion there in the text by Procopius about being cut off. Well, what happens is the Goths seize Ostia, which is this port right next to Rome, and that was the main avenue of supply into the city. And so obviously that's a very dangerous situation to be in. And so Belisarius obviously is doing all he can to try and take Ostia back. And so the Goths start sending like their own kind of cavalry sorties, which Belisarius has to counter. And then from there, where you've mentioned, obviously, there's Roman volunteers, which Belisarius has trained. Belisarius is actually a bit reluctant to use them because they are civilians. They're not proper professional soldiers. He's worried that they may become more of a liability. And in the ensuing battle, they end up being so. He keeps them in reserve as he sends out the bulk of his forces to fight the Goths. What happens is the Goths end up fleeing. The Romans pursue them. The Goths then counterattack and force the Romans back. But then when the battle falls onto the Roman rear guard, the rear guard panic and run, and this leads to a total almost disaster where the Roman army is nearly wiped out, but Belisarius is able to very fortunately withdraw everybody back into the city with minimal damage. But yeah, it just goes to show you why he was had such a reservation about using these civilians, because ultimately when it came to a crisis point, they didn't quite fulfill the role they were supposed to.
That's right. Well, because what happens in that sortie outside the walls is that as you say, like the flanks which contain the militia sort of folded, and so he had to extricate his sort of more elite units out of the fight. Because this sortie happens just outside. You can see on this map here the Porta Salaria, which is up in the north there, just outside the Quirinal Hill, and as you say, most of the armies are drawn in good order, but in fact, at one point, the actual gates are shot because he's actually still, how would I describe this? Basically, he's screening the withdrawal of all the infantry back into the city with his cavalry. And as his cavalry is coming to the city when the rest of the army is evacuated, and the gate's shut because the garrison soldiers are afraid that if they leave the gates open for too long, the Goths will pour into the city. And so he turns around with his Bucellari and his bodyguard, and at this point, the Goths have advanced so much from their initial battle line that they themselves are tired and disorderly. And after a very quick pause and a reformation, the Bucellari turn heel back around. They countercharge the Goths, send them reeling, and after a relatively short pursuit, after which the Byzantines, the East Romans, killed quite a number of these Goths from the vanguard, they turn back to the city, and witnessing the Goths withdrawing from that part of the line, the guardsmen open up the gate, then recognizing Belisarius as well, and so Belisarius does save the day through his own actions and that of his bodyguard. That's probably the last of his major sorties out of the city. But there's another instance that I wanted to touch on, because it isn't actually really canvassed that much, and it is trying to think what the name of the. Oh, actually, hang on. I actually had to record this elsewhere, but I do have the note. Just bear with me for a second. So, outside the Pincian Gate. So we mentioned Enes, also known as Ignatius, was the commander of the Isaurian infantry, and there was two contingents of infantry that actually outside the walls. This is a different skirmish, but around the same time, not long after the first one, and I think that this contingent of infantry numbers about 300, because you have the Isaurians fighting side by side with the Pisidians. Pisidia is also a province in Anatolia, and Ignatius is fighting alongside his brother Tarmutus, and the Phrygians are led by a man by the name of Principius. And after the cavalry is withdrawn, because Belisarius is also fighting in this particular skirmish, in order to not be surrounded by the Goths, the infantry stand and fight. Because after the militia has turned and fled so many times, the actual mainline Byzantine infantry want to prove their worth of Justinian, so that the three commanders say, go in the city and we'll hold the line. And they fight for basically half an afternoon, and this small contingent of a couple hundred men, eventually only a few dozen, make their way back to the city. And it says here from the quotation or from the source that Principius was actually cut down towards the end of the fighting, and Ignatius's brother Tarmutus was covered in wounds and had dozens of arrows stuck in his shield. And even though he managed to sprint back through the gate alongside his surviving men, he died of injuries a couple of days later, and only Ignatius and a couple of a dozen men end up surviving this confrontation with the Goths, in which they say thousands of Goths died, or at least 1,000 Goths died. And so this actually reinstills faith in the infantry, but at a tremendous cost. So this is the desperation in which this battle is actually fought, this entire siege. I figured that was a nice little anecdote that gives some context as to the ferocity of the fighting. And you got to think the siege lasts over a year in length, so it's not a walk in the park for either side.
No, again, I think the symbolic but also strategic importance of Rome is so vital to the war. You can understand why it was the siege was so bitter. But
Precisely.
Another super chat from Longtail for $10. I think the Goths are far more ethnocentric, and their Arianism made them far harder to submit compared to the tribes of Gaul. Also, the sun disappeared in the plague. The sun going always is insane. I'm assuming he means an eclipse. Yeah, that's always a poor omen. Also, he sends a member chat.
Sorry, just on that point as well. Not just the eclipse, but remember, it's said that a massive volcanic eruption occurred. Probably, it's probably likely to have been somewhere like in the Pacific or Indonesia, like a long way away. But so much volcanic material got put up into the atmosphere that, coinciding with the plague, or possibly preceding the plague, this dust cloud basically covers large parts of the civilized world for over a calendar year. And so that's why the Earth itself was dark for a long time. Not only was it preceded by an eclipse, which was already considered an omen, a bad omen at this time, but the actual world goes dark because of this massive quantity of volcanic ash in the air, which then leads to crop failure as well, which you already have a population that suffered pestilence, and now they're starving. So make of that what you will.
Yeah, it's almost like the end times come to Rome again.
Correct.
Yeah. Belisarius, like Scipio, end up fighting quite a lot of corruption charges due to their campaign in the Eastern Africa. Very, very true.
Yes, many such cases.
Both suffer an ignoble end, sadly.
Quite, and indeed they are envied and hated by the bench warmers in the capital. How often that happens, but anyway, here we are.
True.
Actually, wrong Tao Wu. Good comment here about the plague of Heraclius. I know it's not really relevant to the tweet, but the plague of Heraclius, which was the late outbreaks, or rather series of outbreaks, are just as bad in effect to this level plus Islam. Exactly, and so what you're seeing is actually an increasing frequency of these pestilence and plague events, and this ultimately is what sort of spells not a complete end to the urbanization of the Mediterranean, but definitely gives it a very decisive knock, a couple of rungs down. I mean, even sort of, Constantinople was famed for being such a magnificent city of its time, to the point where everyone from the Serbians to the Vikings basically called it the city, and everyone that travels there marvels at it. But even at its very height, Constantinople, at best, maybe approaches half Rome's population height, if that, possibly a third, depending on the estimates you believe about Rome. So, again, make of that what you will.
Oh no, certainly. And yes, it's in the aftermath of this this battle. There's obviously repeated kind of negotiations going on that really lead to anything. And also, sorry, an event I forgot to mention is there was an action taken by Belisarius that was actually quite controversial, which is I mentioned Silverius the Pope, who surrendered the city originally. Well, Belisarius actually has him dismissed and appoints Vigilius as the new Pope. And Belisarius' justification for this was that Silverius was trying to conspire with the Goths, along with many of the Roman senators, which is, again, it's interesting, showing the kind of, if this is true, the attitude where Silverius goes from opening the gates to, just because there's a bit of a the going gets tough, he's like starts conspiring with the Goths. So just, I guess, showing the utter duplicity of the Roman elite at this time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Just actually before we move on as well, I just want to make mention too, because we're talking about like the cavalry sally, and you mentioned about Ostia, because Belisarius does do this a lot. He uses his bucellari as basically like a mobile guard, more or less, like a mobile heavy shock force. He did it at the Milvian Bridge when they first approach Rome, and he sort of does this time and time again. We mentioned the sorties out on the camps. We mentioned the battles outside the walls. You mentioned Ostia as well, and he has a tendency of doing this. This tends to be his favorite tactic, because we even also saw this to a point, even in his early Persian wars. In the beginning of last stream, he has a lot of ingenious tactics that he uses, and he improvises a great deal. But the bucellari, and often led by him, are almost always a decisive sort of turning point of these battles, wherever they're fought, whether it's here or Persia or elsewhere. Certainly Africa as well.
But again, it's around this this time where you kind of have the final climactic battle where the Goths appear to be railing, and then he kind of sends up the rest of his forces for one final counterattack, and the Goths are finally forced to pull back, and the siege of Rome is lifted. And then from there, Belisarius starts advancing into Tuscany and start occupying the various towns there. And it's at this point, because I kind of want your opinion. At this point, I'm actually wondering whether it would have been best had the Byzantines and the Goths come to some compromise, because obviously, yes, there's been a bit of death due to plague, but more or less at this point, Italy's not actually been that badly damaged. Whereas what comes after this,
quite light if you think about it, like in the context of what could happen and what did happen.
Yeah, and so I'm wondering at this point whether Belisarius should have swallowed his pride and come to some compromise with the Goths, where it's like, okay, we keep Italy from Rome southwards, whereas you get to keep the north as like a rump kingdom, and just pay us a bit of lip service, and we'll leave you alone. Because I think long term that may have been better than trying to completely take all of Italy, because from what we are going to go over, the rest of the Gothic War is a massive like urban slog, back and forth, disease, supplies, sacks, looting.
Yeah, I know you're going with this question, and if it was up to me personally, like if I had to sort of make a judgment call on this, I mean, in the end, it's always the whole, oh well, hindsight's 20/20, and it is, even though it's a bit of a trite point to make, but it's true. But I think what they would have done, the thing is, there isn't really an appropriate dividing line, unless you were to use the Tiber itself. It doesn't really work, because then there's no sort of defensive depth for Rome itself, and it's too vulnerable. It's actually funny you got this map up, because I think it's actually quite fitting. If you look to the south of, or between the cities of Ariminum, which is modern day Rimini, and Ancona, there's a small little river that goes from the Apennines to the Adriatic, and then if you head further west, just where Faesulae is, and that runs to the ocean, and that's, I believe, modern day Livorno is around there, or maybe it's La Spezia. I think it's La Spezia. Anyway, and that's pretty close, like Pisa, Lucca, up there, northern Tuscany. You would have had to have like maybe drawn a line along there somewhere, so that Ravenna had sufficient defense in depth, allowed the Goths to keep Ravenna, and then the ERE would keep Rome as sort of like a ceremonial capital, I suppose, because at this point, I don't think there's any changing of the inertia that obviously between Constantine and Anastasius, and these emperors between sort of the first and now Justinian, there's just too much gravity in Constantinople. It's too important a city. There's been too much investment in it. It's a large population center. A lot of institutions are rooted there now. It would make no sense to move the capital back to Rome, which is actually in a more vulnerable place, and who knows, even under the best of circumstances of potentialities, what would be the fate of Rome in a century's time? We don't know, and they wouldn't know. So I don't think that the capital would ever have moved back, but definitely Rome could have remained a part of the empire as definitely a ceremonial capital and as a place of heritage and origin. And with that number of Latins remaining in the empire, I actually don't think that this sort of Hellenization becomes a foregone conclusion either. Maybe it remains like a dualistic empire of being Greco-Italic or something. I mean, who knows? But like I said, I think if you partitioned Italy along a definitive line, particularly those two rivers I mentioned, across the Apennines there, allow the Goths to keep Ravenna as their capital. They would also keep, even though there were strong Roman sympathies in the north, we can actually see on this diagram here, because they do mention the siege of Mediolanum, which was a catastrophe for everybody, the Romans and the Goths, and for everybody else. And there was a lot of sympathy for the Byzantines in the north. Ultimately, they would have had to have drawn a conclusion. I dare say that defensive line I mentioned makes the most sense. And indeed, if the Goths were amenable, they could have remained sort of like a foederati. They would have almost acted like a trying to think of the Byzantine terminology, like in not a theme, not themata as such, but sort of like a vassal sort of like frontier king, like a pronoia of sorts, like a buffer state between these sort of coalescing European powers that would have spring forth after the end of the Dark Age period into the medieval era, and what would be imperial authority in the greater part of the Italian peninsula. Whether either side would have been content with that, who knows? But I dare say you're correct in surmising that would have been a better outcome for all in comparison to what would then play out, hence. The only thing I would ask you, though, is a bit of a counter question is, would this have to occur after capitulation? Would Belisarius still have to march on Ravenna in order for terms to be reached? Would Vitiges give up before Ravenna, in your mind?
Well, it's important to remember that later on, when the first phase is almost over, the Goths are prepared to surrender on the condition that Justinian lets them have a rump kingdom in the north, in like Liguria, Lombardy, and Venetia, like around the Po Valley. And it's actually Belisarius who insists
what they call the Transbedino. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it's actually Belisarius who says, no, I want a total subjugation of the Goths.
Capitulation, yeah.
So again, that's interesting. It's almost like Belisarius is the one who is insisting on the totalization and not on any kind of compromise. Where, I want to propose some alternate divisions. So instead of dividing it at, say, Rome, or even dividing it in, say, Tuscany, what if, because again I've alluded to the Greek south of Magna Graecia, what if the East Roman Empire kept everywhere south of Rome and let the Goths keep Rome? Because again, it would have been better to have assimilated the south, because again, it's largely Greek origin anyway.
Exactly.
Probably would have been more loyal. But also, you have a base from which to attack the Goths if they misbehave themselves again. And another,
correct, yeah.
And in fact, another idea I have is it's not illustrated on this map, but the Byzantines did actually take over Sardinia and Corsica. And so another idea of mine is, well, what if you don't even have a presence on mainland Italy at all, and say, okay, Goths, you can keep mainland Italy, but we're going to hold Corsica, Sardinia, and Sicily, because this gives you a naval command over the Mediterranean, which I think is what the important strategic benefit would have been. So that way, if the Goths misbehave, you can just blockade them.
Yeah, the only thing that I would say from there on in is that also then completely makes the Byzantines reliant on projection naval power, which they certainly were able to do even at this time. Although it would have made Corsica, Sardinia, and Sicily more difficult to resupply. It does sort of make those provinces, you might say, sort of far-reaching, with less of a. I mean, obviously they're still islands; they have to be reached by sea anyway. But by possessing at least, say, southern Italy, there's a semi land bridge, if you get what I mean. Like there are ports between, say, mainland Greece, the Balkans, and Sardinia on mainland Italy, which they could sort of dock at, and there would be a greater ability to, say, reinforce those islands. For example, you'd imagine there'd always be a contingent of troops in southern Italy, which then if they had to deploy to Sardinia or Sicily, they could with relative ease. Because in the end, this sort of like has a parallel as to what would later be known as the Catapanate of the Byzantines would refer to it as Langobardia, and smaller provinces such as Mercurion. Because that's the thing too, like to keep in mind, is if you look at a map of, say, Republican Rome or even like Imperial Rome, certain names move around. Like, for instance, what we understand as Campania today, which is the toe of Italy, was actually the heel in old times, because the toe was actually known as Bruttium, and what is sort of today known as Basilicata, which is like the arch of the boot, was known as Bruttium. Whereas Bruttium's no longer used and Lucania, they're not. Sorry, the toe was Bruttium. The arch was Lucania, and these aren't terms that are really used anymore in a geographical sense. And even by the end of the medieval era, they were no longer used in that context. They had been given new names. The lexicon had changed. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that, in a way, what you're sort of proposing is what would end up being the natural delineation between, say, like the Kingdom of Naples, as we would understand the Norman Kingdom of the Two Sicilies to become, and what is colloquially known as the Mezzogiorno, the east-south divide, which kind of still exists today. And you'd probably draw it somewhere between Rome and Naples there, which has been more or less the traditional dividing line anyway. There's a river actually there just north of, actually, if you see the number 9 there on the map, runs east of that towards the Adriatic. That's probably where you'd do it, I would say, if that's what you're thinking.
Yeah, I think that's probably the best compromise. You split Italy, the Byzantines take the south and Sicily, and I think Corsica and Sardinia, and then the rest you leave as a as an Italo Gothic kingdom in the north. And again, I think had that been a compromise, that would have been much better, because obviously later when you get the Lombards turn up, the Goths could have at least resisted that. And if things got really bad, the Byzantines then could have intervened to prop the Goths up.
Correct. And also, too, you do say, I did mention that point about, would the empire remain like this dualistic Italo-Greek thing, whereas obviously at the south there was a great proportion of Hellenes and there were Italians, even at the point, from any time from the 6th to the 7th century, there was still large Hellenic pockets. I mean, these Hellenic pockets live up until the Byzantine Catapanate, leading up to the Crusader period. They're still there. So it's not as if they've just vanished overnight, and so that would make integration and management of these provinces far easier than trying to maintain a Latin-speaking rump from the central part of the peninsula. I still am of the belief that, like, from like a geostrategic standpoint, the Byzantines would still want to hold, or the East Romans still want to hold at least a portion, the southern half or third of the peninsula, on the base, like I said, for a taxation, large parts of Italy. Like, for instance, when Rome first seized Campania, Naples, and Capua in the Republican days, they were considered breadbaskets. And even today, there's still a lot of grain and grown around there, and like livestock thrives in those parts of Italy. So they would have been economically beneficial to the empire. There's a huge harbour in Taranto, huge harbour in Naples, access to Bari. The Straits of Sicily would have been secure. They would have been able to build the troops there, would make them easy to deploy. They'd be able to base a naval, I suppose, what do you call a task force of sorts there. It would help protect Africa. Africa would also mutually help to protect the islands. That really makes a lot of sense if you're taking all those sort of geostrategic factors into consideration.
And no, certainly. And as fun as it is to engage with these counterfactuals, ultimately that's not what happened. And we now need to delve into the rest of this war, which is going to be a rather depressing. And so you'd mentioned the fate of Milan, so I guess now is the time to address that. So what ends up happening is, with the Byzantine sort of push up from Rome into Tuscany, there was a priest of Milan called Datius who he requests an escort from them so he can return to the city and try and inspire it to rise up and rebel, which he does do so. And so while that is going on, the Goths then siege the city, and this goes on for several months. And despite an attempt to send a relief force, eventually it's not enough. And what ends up happening is the Goths negotiate, where all the Byzantine soldiers can leave, but the city is left to their mercy and it's sacked. All the men are killed and all the women and children sold off into slavery. So we have the desolation of one of the great cities of Italy.
Yeah, and this is also where we see other issues play out. I mean, here 2 and 7 show the attacks of Mundus and Constantinus advancing through Dalmatia, but eventually Narses is given command of this contingent in Dalmatia, and they do make their way to Italy. And there's this difficulty whereby some of the subordinates favor Narses and some of the subordinates remain devoutly loyal to Belisarius. And Belisarius sends a letter to, now you might have to correct me, I can't remember if it's John the Cappadocian or John the Armenian. I want to say it's John the Armenian, to relieve. So at this point, they've actually captured Urbino, or Urbinum on the map here, Aximum, Ancona. Aribinum is under siege. They've captured Faesulae, and I believe I don't think they've invested Vienna at this point when Mediolanum is under siege. But Belisarius sends orders to John to relieve Mediolanum, and then he says, because he was a subordinate of Narses, he says that he's only going to take orders from Narses. And eventually Belisarius writes to Narses. Narses, this is one of the few occasions where they agree that Mediolanum should be relieved, but then John moves at a relatively leisurely pace, and then crossing into Liguria from Aemilia, he contracts some kind of illness. You'd imagine like it would be some sort of form of dysentery or something like that, and eventually camps a couple of days' march from Mediolanum. But by the time that he's there, the garrison is already, and beginning to starve. They are actually in the midst of horrendous starvation. They hold out for a good deal of time. One might say they even lasted a few weeks longer than they should have done, but they're absolutely on the brink of starvation. And they negotiate a surrender with the Goths, but the terms are actually quite firm in that the Goths do allow the Romans to march out under arms and back to lines, but the Goths put the city to the sack, and Mediolanum was at this time and leading up to this point for a number of years, arguably probably a couple of centuries, was alongside Ravenna the most important settlement in northern Italy, was the most prosperous, and was a center for trade and agriculture in this part of the world. And the devastation, the ransack of Mediolanum was very thorough and devastated the city for years, decades afterwards.
And just to give a sort of strategic assessment, I can see the benefits of rising up behind enemy lines, but I think this was far too early considering how far away Mediolanum was from the front lines in Tuscany and in sort of Emilia and in Romana. So I think a better strategy would have been saying, this is a good idea, Dacius, but I think you should feign loyalty for now and prepare for an eventual uprising, but only when we give you like an order to. So perhaps once, the centre of Italy's been successfully pacified and you're actually pushing up into Lombardy, then revolt at that point, because then you would ensure it was a decisive move without this kind of like, we're kind of in an impossible situation now, because it's I alluded to the fact the Goths were trying to scheme with the Franks was actually the Burgundians under Theudebert, one of the sons of Clovis, who's one of who's the king of Burgundy. He's the one who actually comes in and actually sieges Milan alongside the Goths. And
well, at this point, they provide the greater bulk of the soldiers, ultimately.
Yeah, exactly. So you've got the Frankish scheming, but later Belisarius is able to negotiate with Theudebert, and the Franks then withdraw from the conflict. Ensuring that they won't have to fight them as an enemy, but too little, too late for Milan, sadly.
Indeed, and that's the thing too, is that there is the landing you see from Ostia to Mediolanum. There's like a naval task force that lands, captures Genoa, and marches towards Mediolanum. But basically, that task force and the troops involved were not near strong enough to provide a complete garrison, and they arrived with no supplies. And if there's something that imperils a garrison, it is not having supplies. It was so far behind enemy lines, they had no ability to provision. That's why, you see here actually on the right hand side there, it's got that sort of what do you call it? That descriptions here. The campaign is launched April 538, and basically the Burgundians and the Goths basically put the city immediately under siege at the end of April, and are besieging it all the way till March the following year. So it's an 11-month siege. There was no time for them to provision the countryside at all. Like the city was immediately was invested straight away, and that's why the garrison and the city ultimately suffered the fate that it did. If there was an ability to at least prepare or bring in supplies and stocks and at least provision to a degree, you'd imagine they would have had more leeway, but it just didn't happen for them. And that's where I am inclined to agree with you that this idea, although in some ways kind of ingenious and opportunistic, was half-baked and done too soon, and they paid a pretty steep consequence for this misjudgment.
And so from the point of Narses, the final sort of push to the end of the first phase is both Belisarius and Narses. There's a flurry of sieges in here in the central part of Italy, mostly in what is now Romana and Urbino. So it's Urbanum, Urbs, Vetus, Oxenum, and Thesula through the kind of summer of 538 through to the autumn of 539. And then finally, Ravenna is open and vulnerable. and there's a blockade, and then this is where you get the final Gothic surrender. But as I alluded to previously, Justinian is able to negotiate a surrender with the Goths, where it's like, okay, you can keep Ravenna and you can keep Milan, you can keep the Po Valley and Venice as like a little rump vassal of ours. And to be honest, as I alluded to earlier with Belisarius' opposition saying, no, I think we should there'll only be peace when it's on our total capitulation of the Goths. And it's interesting because the Goths say, well, Justinian, if Belisarius won't agree to peace, this peace is a dead letter, essentially, which again I think is a bit of insubordination on Belisarius' part. And I will actually say in this instance, I do think Justinian probably made the right call. I think keeping a kind of rump Gothic kingdom in the north would have at least served as some kind of buffer, whereas by demanding the total capitulation of the Goths is probably what led to the disaster that came later.
Absolutely. And also it's worth noting too that, as much as the Burgundians and later the Franks entered Italy, well, initially, if you sort of go back far enough, initially it was Justinian who, utilizing the now very adept arms of Byzantine diplomacy and espionage, to actually bring the Franks in to harass the Goths initially, to make the initial invasion easier, which they did do. They then end up moving into northern Italy on the side of the Goths to attack the Romans, the East Romans. And then eventually, once the East Romans and the Ostrogoths are both sufficiently weak and then end up fighting for themselves, the Burgundians and the Franks end up attacking both Ostrogothic and Ostrogothic and Byzantine Roman forces in northern Italy, and it allows them to like carve a path that is eventually filled by the Lombards. Funnily enough, I don't know why I keep saying Bulgarians. Sorry, it's all after midnight where I am, so I'm a bit tired. But anyway, Bulgarians are nowhere to be seen for at least another couple of centuries, so never mind me.
I don't know. Fair enough. Bulgarians, they eventually become, Orthodox. They claim the title of Tsar, Caesar. They had Roman ambitions. It's easy to mistake.
Correct. Yes. Who can forget the northern Italian Tsardom of Bulgaria? But anyway, I digress.
Bulgaria, the first Slavic Rome before Russia, if you think about it.
That's right. Yeah, the true third Rome, right?
No, exactly. But also, there's something else we can't skip past is that, obviously, with Belisarius has Ravenna surrounded, and the Goths are saying they won't surrender unless Belisarius agrees. They then give him a offer, which is, okay, Belisarius, we'll totally capitulate and surrender to you, but it's only on the condition that you take the crown and become king of Italy of a restored Western Roman Empire. And the counterfactuals and what ifs, I think, are quite interesting from this. And I think we did talk a little bit about this last time. But essentially, what happens is Belisarius says, okay, I agree to this. He marches in and gets their surrender and then says, oh, by the way, I have no intention of becoming king. And you're all part of the empire now and submit to Justinian. And obviously this is to the chagrin of the Goths because they didn't appreciate being played in this manner. But I think this was a master move by Belisarius because essentially he shows the loyalty to the empire, but he gets the Goths to finally surrender without a fight. But however, unfortunately, this doesn't help him because this offer makes Justinian incredibly suspicious of Belisarius. So immediately after this victory, Belisarius is shunted off to the east to fight the Persians without a triumph or any kind of significant reward or compensation for his time or his efforts. And
actually, I was going to say, just before we move on as well, because you mentioned the spate of these captures of cities leading up to Ravenna, actually, we both touched on it, is that when you have that mix up with John and Mediolanum, Narses is actually temporarily recalled to Constantinople, but then he's actually sent back and he's actually dispatched with reinforcements, which allows Belisarius to prosecute this sort of end of the first phase of the conflict. Because basically, without these reinforcements, I do struggle to imagine how Belisarius, for all of his brilliance and genius, could have actually prosecuted the end of this campaign and actually been in a position to take Ravenna, whether by force or by trickery as occurred in our reality. Just worth mentioning that.
Oh no, that's a fair point. So one final push for victory. But again, to entertain this idea, what if Belisarius was like, all right, okay, I accept, I'll become the king of Italy, restored Western Emperor. Well, what immediately would have happened is that Justinian would not have accepted that, and you would have immediately had a continuation of the war. But this time, I think Belisarius and all of his forces would have been fighting with the Rump Gothic forces against a renewed assault. This time, probably under Narses, who and also probably all of the officers that didn't like Belisarius. And of course, the Franks have already been sticking their oar, and they probably would have intervened as well. So I think it would have been a very hard fought and disastrous campaign, and it probably would have led to even more devastation of Italy had Belisarius actually tried to establish a restored empire in the West.
Indeed. And also, too, as much as I have been critical of Justinian's inability to sufficiently support a campaign, the arrival, or rather the reintroduction of Narses to the field in 538, as you can see here, number 14 on that little list there, had it not been sent, there's every possibility that either this would have been a hellish stalemate, or indeed the Goths may have still been in a position to have actually rolled back Belisarius's gains. And again, to touch on what you said about a even worse outcome, we probably would have seen an even worse outcome, because it would be a complete decay of both imperial and Gothic authority in the peninsula at the same time. So the fact that these reinforcements are dispatched, because Justinian was always a little bit reluctant to back these campaigns up with reinforcements. It's one of the rare instances where he actually does that, and it leads to a positive outcome, which you imagine should have been indicative towards Justinian. But anyway, it's not a pattern that emerges frequently, sadly. But this is one instance where he actually does that.
But it's important to remind people that the reason Justinian seems to be trusting Narses more than Belisarius is because Narses is a eunuch, and he's also an Armenian. So again, he's essentially a foreign, impotent servant of his, who is no threat to him, because no one is going to respect a Byzantine
and he's
emperor.
A creature, and he's a creature of the Byzantine urban elite, like he's from the court. So there's that as well.
Yeah, exactly. And so whereas Justinian was always a bit fearful of Belisarius, because Belisarius was always popular with the soldiers and the army. And, there was this legacy of, barracks emperors, from the crisis of the 3rd century. So I bet you there's like some sort of doomsday nightmare scenario for Justinian. Belisarius becomes a renewed emperor of the West, and oh no, what if he invades me and deposes me?
Yeah. Also, in a sense, like, there's also because you touched on it by saying that Belisarius was hugely popular, and you sort of, I suppose Scipio was popular, but I don't know if he was quite like the darling of Rome as, say, other generals. But in some ways, he was kind of, and I don't really want to compare him to Caesar, because I mean, Caesar eventually ended up becoming, like a dictator / the ruler of Rome in all but name. But there was an acclaim of Belisarius that I think exceeded even that of Scipio. He was a very celebrated figure, and yet he was a superbly loyal general, and in many ways a peer to Justinian, because you got to think they were sort of friends even before Justinian became emperor, like under the service of his uncle Justin. And sort of in some ways quite tragic to sort of see this relationship between the two unravel in this way, for no other reason than sort of suspicion and court intrigue, probably much of which was fueled by Theodora and potentially Narses, but that's a bit hard to ascertain. And in some ways, it's almost like, if I can, it's a bit of a crude comparison, but in some way that, if I dare may use the analogy that, Rommel was like the darling of the Reich, and for instance, there were people in the regime who were annoyed that a mere general was the darling, and almost like he was too popular. I kind of get that vibe from Belisarius, where he sort of is almost more popular than the emperor himself for his successors, and that's always dangerous for a king or an emperor when that ends up being the case, if you get my drift.
Yeah, well, it's important to remember as well that the Justinian dynasty, including Justin's uncle Justin, they were plebs from the Balkans. Their claim on the throne was muck. I mean, Belisarius has won all these great victories, so in some context, you could argue Belisarius has a better claim to be emperor of Rome than Justinian does.
Correct. Yeah. Exactly.
Yes, I enjoy we both. There are hot were vile thoughts.
Yes. If we may use the allegory, 2 thoughts in a pod. But anyway, we digress.
To lean into Belisarius being redeployed to Persia, part of the reason for this is I think it's around this time when it's the plague of Justinian. Justinian actually captures the plague, and he kind of goes off into like a prolonged period of isolation, and Theodora is pretty much ruling everything. And because she's friends with Antonina, she and Antonina basically are responsible for pulling Belisarius out of Italy. And there's even a period where I think Theodora has Justinian like under house arrest, and has Belisarius. Belisarius.
Yeah. I don't said Justinian under house arrest. It's like, her own husband. That'd be difficult. Actually, that being said.
Well, I was going to say, technically, Justinian was, if you think about it, I mean, he was ill with the plague and shut off in a bedchamber, so effectively it's kind of house arrest.
Well, I was actually going to elucidate on that point side, because it actually said, sources suggest this, that he was essentially comatose for like a number of months, potentially up to a year of being very, very badly incapacitated. I mean, this isn't just like having a light cough and having the sniffles for a couple of weeks. I mean, for a source to suggest that he was almost comatose and not seen for the better part of a year. I mean, there would have been people in the empire, never mind the city, who probably thought he had died. I mean, not many people lived and recovered from plague, although Justinian does, but it's a very rare occurrence, considering the virility of this plague.
I mean, exactly. And, who does Theodora owe her position to? It's to her husband. So if Justinian dies, Belisarius is a massive threat to her.
That's right. And I mean, I was going to say, if I can, there's actually quite a very revealing and stark quotation from Procopius about the state of the plague, if you allow me to say it.
Sure.
Or to add to the conversation. He says here that the grave diggers were readily busy digging increasing numbers of holes around the city in order to bury the dead. But when the grave diggers could no longer keep up with the massive numbers of daily mortalities, they scaled the fortifications of the walls in Psyche, which are the fortifications around the Galata district, which is on the other side of the Golden Horn. They tore off the roofs of these towers which line the walls, and after scaling them, threw the dead bodies inside in complete disorder, and stacked them high until the towers were full to bursting before placing the roofs back on. After which an evil smell permeated from the packed towers and spread all over the city, distressing and begrieving the residents greatly, and especially so when the wind blew fresh from that direction. So you got to think, across the entirety of the Theodosian walls, there was about 170 odd, I think 176 towers. And on the Galata side, it was a smaller number, but I think there was at least a couple of dozen towers around the Galata. So you got to think these were massive fortifications, massive towers, and they were packed to the brim with human bodies that just would decay and rot. And God knows what was found there afterwards. But to think that the gravediggers were this overwhelmed by the scale of death is actually almost impossible for people like us to imagine. And so for Justinian to have contracted this illness, you got to think the vast majority of his subjects would have imagined he would die. It's actually a miracle that didn't. And not just that too, Justinian is actually the most long-lived emperor of them all. I'm not sure if he's the longest reigning monarch. You'd have to imagine he'd be close, if not also the longest reigning monarch, but he lived until the age of 86. He was a very, very long-lived emperor.
83, I think, because he reigned for...
83.
It was 38 years, and he became emperor at 45, so it was 83 when he died. Yeah. So his reign was slightly shorter than Augustus, but he actually lived longer than Augustus, because Augustus was in his 70s.
I thought it was close. Yeah, yeah. It'd have to be close. Yeah. But anyway, you got to think like it. You got to think to live into your almost your mid-80s after having contracted the bubonic plague is quite the miracle.
Certainly. Though I mentioned John Julius Norwich earlier, I remember again in his books on Byzantium that he actually thinks it was a disaster Justinian living as long as he did, because he thinks by the last 10 years of his life he'd become rather senile, and because he insisted on kind of doing everything himself in terms of the administration and government of the empire, he almost took too much of a burden on himself, and this probably led to a lot of neglect, if you know what I mean. And so he says it may have been for the better had he retired, or perhaps had maybe died 10 years earlier.
I'm inclined to agree. There is that sort of dynamic that does happen where people do stick around for too long, particularly in the case of of imperium or in monarchy, where eventually, unless you're the most brilliant of men, but even then the most brilliant of men still suffer from this, that you just become complacent, and with age you always have those the forces of time that play out. You become more rigid in your ways, you become less mentally adept and agile, and there is always senility around the corner, as you say, and then of course, as the old adage brings out, all rot starts from the head down, and you can't help but wonder. I mean, I know there's a whole bunch of circumstances around, Morris and Phocas and Heraclius and the rise of Islam in that period, but you kind of wonder how much of the weakness of Rome in that time arguably had roots from this period. I mean, this stream isn't about that, but one can't help but think and ponder the question.
No, certainly. And just to address a comment from Iron Duke, Belisarius could have made himself emperor, but the great general was too loyal. Well, as I've elucidated, Duke, I don't think the problem was Belisarius' loyalty, because again, I think had he become emperor, I don't think it would have worked out very well. But what I will say I think it's not a question of Belisarius' loyalty. It was rather Justinian's trust of Belisarius. Like, I think the best outcome, Marcus, would have been instead of being sent off to Persia, I think Belisarius should have been kept in Italy as, like a governor general, like a provincial administrator, consolidating the gains made, and someone who the Goths at least knew and could probably work with. And that probably
basically an exarch of sorts.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So not an emperor, but the ruler of Italy in all but name. So.
Yeah. Oh, I'm inclined to agree. I think that's very, because that's the other thing too, is you dispatch someone from Italy to go to Persia, and then you return to Italy, and then you have to reorganize the administration. A policy which you had carried out had not been followed by someone else, and then if you choose to change direction again, it requires change in local policy, dealings with the local populace, matters of administration and governance, and in this particular instance, obviously because it's occurring in the midst of a war, military campaigns, appointing commanders, all the military organization associated with that, billeting, reinforcement, troop payment, requiring reinforcements, deployments, organizing new campaigns, dealing with fresh enemies, because at this point, as we've just briefly mentioned, you've had influx of Burgundians into Italy, not Bulgarians, Burgundians, Franks, and later Lombards, alongside this sort of nascent Gothic remnant in the north, and switching between sort of, if you could use the word, theatre commanders, just makes all that so much more difficult. Maybe Belisarius was sent east because he was probably the best person to deal with the Persians, and especially with the death of Mundus, there wasn't really anyone that had, experience fighting the Persians at this point, aside from Bessus maybe, but there's always that to consider as well.
Certainly, and just another comment from Duke. Sure, but for the wives, Justinian probably would have fully trusted Belisarius. That's true to an extent, but it's important to remember is we'll get to the third phase of the Gothic War and Belisarius' return to Italy. But what leads to Belisarius' second withdrawal later is because Theodora dies and Antonina gets Belisarius recalled because she fears that the campaign is about to go awry, and she does not want her prospects being muck because her husband's just been humiliated losing a campaign. by a a rather irate emperor. And if anything, for the remaining years of his life, Belisarius just does nothing and just kicks about in retirement until the final battle at Melantius. So, if anything, even with Theodora out the way, Justinian just didn't seem to trust in Belisarius. So I think it's more a case of a position of trust and friendship was just worn down over the years, and sadly.
And plus, also, if Theodore had been constantly drip feeding Justinian from the time of the end of the Vandalic War and throughout the majority of the course of the Ostrogothic War in Italy, how much of that prejudice was sort of built upon a long time of, like, how do you call it? I don't know if you'd even call it propaganda necessarily, but like this sort of day-to-day sort of conditioning and drip feeding of a certain narrative, and then sort of eventually Justinian just accepts it as truth. If you get what my meaning, like, eventually it sort of reinforces the suspicion, and the suspicion, brings about the narrative, and it sort of becomes this sort of self-perpetuating lie, if you can call it that.
Absolutely. And again, age. I think Justinian was losing a lot of his neuroplasticity, as Dan of the Low Diseases would like to say, and I think that sort of restricted any kind of elastic or flexible thinking.
Exactly.
And so that's now it's time we probably get to the Lazic War. So on this map here, this is the frontiers of the Roman Empire after all the conquests. So the Lazica is this area over here. That's sort of like a light pink. It's roughly in what's now modern day Georgia. So this was a vassal kingdom of Rome that the Sassanids had kind of been encroaching on to take over. So this is after the previous Iberian War, which led to the so-called, perpetual peace, where Justinian agreed to pay tribute to the Sassanids for a long period of peace, but obviously that doesn't last very long, and the Sassanids break it and try to take advantage of the Byzantine distraction in the west with the Gothic War. And this is actually also a very long conflict. It lasted about 20 years, and Belisarius doesn't actually play much of a role. He's just quickly brought over to try and shore things up before being redeployed back to Italy again. And so he marches into Mesopotamia in the summer of 541. He moves his forces towards the city of Nisibis, and the Roman advance guard actually ignores Belisarius's orders because he wants to have them keep watch for any Persian attacks. And what ends up happening is the Persians sally out of the city and rout the Romans into retreat. So again, this is one of the very few defeats Belisarius ever suffers, and again, it's not even his own fault. It's just his soldiers being insubordinate. Oh, Marcus has stepped away for one moment, so I'll carry on summarising. So the Romans then move to siege the city of Thessaloniki, but their attacks are repulsed. Eventually, the garrison of the city does surrender, and some of Belisarius's forces break off to raid Persian territory, and they later end up returning home. And then the Sassanid king Khusro assembles an army and invades Roman Syria. Belisarius gathers his forces at Europos and sets up an advanced camp of about 6,000 men, and this is a ruse to trick the Persians into thinking they were facing a much greater force. And later, Belisarius sends a 1,000-strong cavalry force to try and pressure the Persians. So, using a clever use of trickery, Belisarius is able to prolong and get rid and prevent a Persian attack from a much larger force. And around this time, there had been some negotiations for a prospective peace, and that included the Persians not attacking the city of Callinicum, which was in Syria. And Khusro breaks his word and then captures the city. But before Belisarius can counterattack and retake it, Justinian recalls him back to Italy for the third phase of the Gothic War. And so on this map here, the orange lines are showing the movements during the first phase, and for this next phase, we want to look at the green lines, which is the Gothic counterattack and so what happens in the preceding sort of few years between the Gothic defeat and Belisarius's recall to Italy is a consortium of commanders of about 5 men are put in charge of the garrison of Italy, and due to a series of bickering and sort of disagreements amongst themselves, the Goths are able to take advantage of this infighting, and it leads to a counterattack where they essentially reverse most of the Roman gains over the preceding years. And you're back, Marcus.
Yeah, sorry about that. Just had to grab a beverage. Yeah, indeed. I can see from the map here that the Ostrogothic realm obviously does even, we haven't mentioned this before, but does extend even beyond the Alps into what was sort of historically Pannonia, Raetia, parts of Raetia into Noricum. And even though there's that sort of those campaigns by Mundus and Constantinius, and also Narses crossing over in the early 550s. Indeed, most of the that's afterwards actually. That's another counterattack. But you can see here that, as you just said, I just caught the end of that. The Goths essentially reverse the gains in mainland Italy, and even push as far down as Otranto, which is sort of the heel of Italy. And this is where the absolute desolation of Italy starts to happen in the context of the onset of this plague that's infected the emperor and killed anywhere from a third to half of the subjects of the empire, its citizens. You also start to see this devastation as a result of the exchange of cities and struggles across all these sieges and capturing and recapturing, attacks, counterattacks all across the peninsula. And this is really what you might call like the beginning of the end of what was old classical Italy into a much depopulated and poorer Italy, which would sort of become sort of realized in the what we might call the Dark Age period. I hate that terminology, but for the sake of time scale, that's how we can surmise it.
Certainly, and the Goths have a new king called Totila, and it's in this the aftermath of this sort of counterattack that Belisarius is brought back. But it should be noted that this time, if we think the resources were given originally were quite low, this time Justinian gives him even less. He only has like 1,000 men that come with him, and if I'm going to be cynical and ascribe some sort of deviousness to Justinian, I've got a feeling that Justinian deliberately was setting Belisarius up to fail, and just so he could get rid of him, and so that he can then send Narses in later to mop up.
Either to fail or die, and or both.
Exactly. And I just want to read.
Even at this point, just to say, just before you read the thing, at this point, despite everything they've been through, even the emperor Justinian is underestimating his longtime compatriot and friend, who, if anyone should know of Belisarius' capabilities, it should be Justinian. Sorry, continue.
No, exactly. And yeah, this is just a reading from Procopius about Belisarius' speech when he lands at Ravenna. Okay. Such was the fate that befell Tivoli. As for Belisarius, he arrived at Ravenna with the whole fleet, where he gathered the Goths who were present and the Roman soldiers and spoke as follows. This will not be the first time that the achievements of virtue have been nullified by wickedness. This is a wholly natural aspect of human affairs from ancient times, and the malice of wicked persons has often managed to frustrate and destroy the deeds of good men. Now, to this very thing has ruined the cause of the emperor. He is so deeply concerned to correct the mistakes which have been made that he dreams the task of defeating the Persians as less important than this situation, and so decided at that present time to send me to you so that I may be able to set right and heal whatever he has been done wrongly by the officers to his soldiers or to the Goths. Certainly, it is not human that no one should make any mistakes at all, a thing that would be natural besides, but the task of setting right the mistakes that have been made eminently befits an emperor, and can console those whom he loves. Not only will you be free of distress, but also you will be immediately grasp and enjoy the emperor's goodwill towards you. Of all things in the world, what could be more valuable for a man than this? Seeing then that I am here with you for this very purpose, it is incumbent upon each one of you to exert himself to the utmost so that you may profit from this opportunity. If any one of you happens to have relatives or friends with the usurper Totila, let him summon them as quickly as possible, explaining the emperor's purpose. In this way you may gain the blessings that flow both from peace and from the mighty emperor. For my part, I have neither come here with a lustful war against anyone, nor would I ever willingly be an enemy of the emperor's subjects. If, however, they consider it too demeaning a thing to opt for a course then that it is better for them and take their stand against us, it will be necessary for us to treat them as enemies, even though it is sorely against our will. So again, I think Belisarius is trying to appeal to people's better natures here. So listen, you don't want to carry this war on. Just if you come over and surrender, we won't come after you, basically. But to no avail. And then for the next 5 years or so, you just have this kind of a long drawn out guerrilla war where there's troops sort of moving around, sieges, cities taken, cities recaptured, and in fact, it's during this period where Rome is actually captured and then lost to the Goths twice under Belisarius.
Exactly. It changed hands 3 times, and you can see from the numbers here, there's 5 contests for the city. 536, 546, 547, 549, 552. Speaks a lot about the degree of struggle.
Exactly. And again, this idea of what Justinian's intention was, giving Belisarius so few men, it's almost like he perhaps was thinking, Belisarius isn't so much a general as he is a kind of like an armed diplomat, if you will. I mean, he can just talk to the Goths and just work something out, and if he fails, I'll have an excuse to get rid of him.
You know those instances from sort of early Republican history where a consul will be sent with, like a couple of cohorts, and they'll dispatch them to like the Achaean League or to King Philip of Macedon, or or that famous instance where a consul was sent to negotiate between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, and I just forget the name of the man in
it's
question.
funny you said that's the example I was thinking of. No, it's the consul was sent to negotiate with Antiochus IV Epiphanes when he was literally on the verge of conquering the Ptolemaic kingdom, and the Romans say to him, "No, if you advance, we will destroy you." And he's fought. And Antiochus,
you must decide before you step out of this circle.
Yes, exactly.
That's essentially the role that, actually, I've never thought the comparison, but it's so true. That is essentially the role that Belisarius is almost entrusted with at this point, and does it with great aptitude, funnily enough.
Well, I forgot to mention this, but Belisarius was actually made a consul at one point. So, I mean, quite literally, Belisarius is using him as a kind of diplomat.
Indeed, and it should be worth mentioning too that at this point, even though the Senate is formally relocated to Constantinople, many of the ranks of the old Roman system still exist, even though it's in a new city. I mean, even the rank of patrician, for instance, even if you go all the way up until the latter stages of what we call the Byzantine Empire, I mean, they still use the term patrikos, which is patrician for a man who sits in the senatorial chamber. I mean, that's a tradition they keep right up until almost the Paleologum period. So it goes to show you that these ranks are not just sort of bywords. The fact that even though he was a consul, the consul technically didn't have power in the same way it did in, say, the era of Sulla or Caesar or Scipio, for instance. It still deferred to Belisarius as sort of a gravitas, as sort of attached to his status as a general and a successful military commander. For him it was very useful, but it also was demonstrative to both the people of Italy and the various powers contesting the Italian peninsula that he was not a man to be trifled with.
No, exactly. But unfortunately, his appeal to the Goths doesn't work. Totila takes Spoleto, and then Belisarius then spends the next several months camping in Illyrium, just there where Salona is on the map, trying to get more reinforcements together. And the situation is so bad for the Italians that the Pope at the time, who was Vigilius, the man Belisarius who had put in, obviously the Goths see him as Belisarius's man, so he's actually forced to flee the city and is running around trying to organize a grain shipment to the various Byzantine garrisons, but this ends up getting intercepted by the Goths. So yeah, the supply situation is a complete disaster.
Because at this point as well, it's worth mentioning that the situation that Belisarius found himself in the first siege of 536, at this point, the institutions and the day-to-day sort of economic life of the peninsula had changed, especially in the post-plague era. There was just not the manpower to take and reap the harvests. and also in the context of following this, this year-long, or the year of darkness, they call it, the eclipse followed by the aftermath of the volcanic eruption. There's crop failures, and of course, with the mass demographic decline, there's simply not the labor force to partake in the operations of agriculture, and so there's a food shortage. And of course, the peninsula in general is being devastated, and all these things conspire to the kind of ingenious solution that Belisarius thought of in terms of milling the grain on the banks of the Tiber with the water-bound mills is just not possible. There's not even the grain to do that anymore, never mind the manpower to do it. And so the privation and sort of sufferance and destitution of Italy, and the harm brought upon its population is sort of magnified as a result of all this.
No, exactly. And so to move forward, obviously we mentioned that Rome is contested several times. Well, the lead up to sort of the first sort of loss of Rome, really, in this third phase is Belisarius ends up pulling back because there had been another commander called Isarches, where he'd heard that this command had been captured because it was defending the city of Portus. So because of this false report, that's what caused Belisarius to fall back, and it's what lets the Goths come in. And so I think this is probably in his entire career, this is probably Belisarius's greatest error of judgment, falling for this false news.
Indeed, I mean, he's defeated very few times, but this and Dara's not even really particularly bad. I mean, you know what I mean? It's a case of, sorry, not Dara itself. No, it was in that war though he's defeated by the Persians, but his army's still extricated with minimal losses. But to lose Rome, and to lose Rome on a false report, is quite devastating if you think about it, given his previous successes and his intelligence as a military leader.
Well, the only consolation is able to persuade Totila to not sack the city.
Exactly. Which, given the privation of the city, never mind the entire countryside, is a small mercy to the people of Rome.
Though what does happen next is one of Belisarius' sort of a sub-commanders is able to pull off a bit of a ruse called Martianus. He pretends to defect to the Goths, which Totila falls for because Totila had Martianus' wife and children captive. So in exchange for defection, he would free them. So the wife and children are freed, and then Martianus, then when he goes to enter the city of Perugia, he saves the garrison commander and then opens the gates for the Romans to come in and take the city. So that was a very cunning plan there to deceive Totila. And Belisarius obviously then tries to retake Rome, but he keeps being pushed back due to Gothic ambushes. But then he has another attempt which is successful. And what he then does to try and trick the Goths into not attacking is that he creates a ruse where he makes the walls look like they're in a better state than they actually were, in order to reduce them to non-attack, which again is, as I've alluded to when you were briefly and talking about the Larzic War, he does the same, where there's a massive Persian army bearing down upon him, but he tricks the Persians to think he's got a much larger force than he actually does.
Yeah, when he has his troops erect all the extra banners and light more campfires, but there's not nearly as many troops as what is indicated by the Persian scouts, but they sort of see the banners and see the campfires and think, oh, Belisarius has a larger force than we thought. We'll retreat now. It was a complete bluff, and it worked.
Yeah, no, exactly. So another one of his key talents is the art of deception. Yeah, so Totila obviously launches more assaults on the walls, but ultimately this is unsuccessful. Belisarius starts repairing the defenses of the city again, where the Goths then withdraw to Tivoli and they rebuild the fort there, but they destroy all the bridges over the Tiber except for the Milvian Bridge. And just because Belisarius at this point is able to finally get some reinforcements from Justinian, which are being sent down to Calabria. Belisarius sails to Taranto, but a storm forces him to dock at Croton, which is a city that's around the kind of around where the heel is.
Yeah, Croton is kind of. I hate to try and use like physiological expressions for geographical reference, but you know how you have like the ball of your foot that's in front of the arch. That's where Crotone is. You know how there's like 3 rivers that come out of the heel, out of the arch of the boot. That most forward one, the most westernmost one, that's basically where Crotone is, in that sort of bay at the very sort of westernmost point of the arch.
Mm-hmm.
So it's that border country between Calabria and what we would call Puglia, sort of through there.
Yeah, I was getting the location mixed up with Tarentum, which is nearby, just a little further east.
No, perfectly fine. The thing is, when you see sort of all these names scribbled on a map, it does get confusing. Like, Taranto, Brundisium, Bari, Otranto, they all sort of merge into one in the end.
Well, they're both former Greek colonies as well, so it's probably where I got them mixed up. So
correct.
And they were both allies of Pyrrhus during the Pyrrhic Wars as well. So
indeed, yeah, as was Otranto and Reggio, all these cities in the south. Many of them defected to Pyrrhus, as we know.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and Belisarius then goes to actually take Taranto by, he docks at Croton due to the storm, and because there's not enough provisions, he sends his cavalry to try and block the passages into the area, and there's another Gothic attack which is repelled. However, Totila is able to assemble another force, and is able to catch the Romans off guard and completely wipes them out. And Belisarius is then forced to completely abandon the mainland and has to sail to Messina in response. So, the situation is totally dire. And what ends up then happening is, due to a lot of Slavic raids over the Danube, Justinian does send more reinforcements, but it's only like 2,000 men that are sent. And so they rejoin Belisarius at Otranto. And it's actually at this point that Antonina then departs for Constantinople to try and persuade Theodora to send more men. But this is when Theodora dies, and Antonina, fearing that due to the disastrous situation where it's looking like, oh shit, we're about to be defeated, I don't want to go down humiliated with my husband, who's probably going to be blamed for this. She persuades Justinian in his grief to withdraw, pull back Belisarius, and send Narses instead. And then the final phase is just Narses mopping up everything ultimately.
Indeed, and the thing is here where Narses just, even though this is in the context of, like you said, the Slavic invasion of the Balkans, post the plague, and I mean, sadly, I just had to step out. We didn't cover the Lazic War, but after the Lazic War, but everybody in Italy is so exhausted that even with sort of a relatively minor reinforcement and having dispatched Narses a second time in 551, everyone is so weakened in Italy that actually, like you say, it's basically a mop-up operation at this point. I mean, I'm not going to say it's a total cakewalk for Narses, but and also because he has this complete trust of Justinian, he's given the leeway and the trust to prosecute the campaign as it should have been done, in the decade prior. But Narses does, to his credit, mop up Italy and more or less complete the job.
One thing I will say about Narses is, we were talking about how old Justinian was when he died. Well, Narses, not only does he outlive Justinian, I think he lives into like his 90s.
Exactly, yeah. Even more grand in his age, that's for sure.
Certainly. And after this, Belisarius goes into effectively retirement. He's very popular with the people, but it doesn't stop him being harassed, because there's a point later where Justinian blames Belisarius for some sort of there's like rumors of like a plot or a coup against him, and so Belisarius is deprived of his possessions and put under arrest for a while before he's pardoned and released. And then with the last battle, so to speak, we're in 559, the Bulgars under Khan Zabagan raid over the Danube, and Belisarius is given a tiny force of 300 veterans and 1,000 civilians to defeat this 2,000-strong cavalry force. Also should mention this was before he was arrested in 562, but again, it just keeps showing you like the later in life Belisarius gets, the less Justinian trusts him and the less force he's given to try and resolve the various problems he's sent to dealt with. And again, it's almost like just Justinian is like, I dare you, Belisarius, to fail.
Exactly, and no matter what, he's still in his old age and with all of his war experience and his faculties, his own personal courage and knack for adaptability. He just finds a way to sort of never get, I mean, he does suffer setbacks. We know this. We just covered that discussing the Italian campaign, but he sort of pulls through in the end. He sort of does find a way to sort of pull victory from the jaws of defeat, and with meager forces he still accomplishes much, which does and also magnify his talent as a general.
No, certainly, and obviously we've talked about all the various distrust and scheming of Justinian against Belisarius, but as bad as that was, the actual legacy of that is even worse, because there's an apocryphal legend that Justinian has Belisarius blinded, and Belisarius lives out the final days as a blind beggar on the streets of Rome, which again I think is a very ominous kind of image. But again, from what I understand, it's largely apocryphal, and there's no. Sorry.
So you don't think it's true?
I don't think it's true. No.
Yeah, neither do I. I mean, I agree with you. It's apocryphal, and it's sad that such a rumor or such an apocryphal story has come to the fore, because even I think for all of Justinian's failures and misgivings and for his increasing paranoia, I still can't see that he would do that to Belisarius. And in any case, Belisarius had never done anything in his life to remotely deserve a fate half as bad as that.
Look, I mean, did Justinian treat Belisarius badly? Yes. Was Justinian so sadistic that he was going to leave Belisarius to a fate like a blind beggar? No, because ultimately you have to instill some kind of loyalty, and doing that to one of your greatest general, I think, is not going to instill loyalty from anybody.
Exactly. I do wonder though. I wonder if, because this is the thing, Procopius obviously writes, his history, and then there's the secret history which comes after. And as we know, Procopius was the allotted scribe to Belisarius, and obviously became his friend, for the greater part of each other's lives. And I kind of do wonder if I think it's certainly a big part of it, but if the mistreatment of Belisarius and being witness to the increasing, don't use the word derangement. That doesn't describe Justinian appropriately or accurately, but his increasing degrees of anxiety, perhaps cruelty, these failings that men of high ideals don't like to see in their leaders and their emperors and kings and whatever. And I kind of wonder how much of this, and being so close, so proximal to Belisarius, prompts Procopius to write his basically rewritten secret history.
It's possible, but I think we discussed this last time. But there is a section in the first chapter called the Gynocracy, where Procopius is just railing against the photocracy of Antonina and Theodora, basically saying the empire's being ruled by women, and he kind of says that both Justinian and Belisarius are shameful because they're just letting their women like run the empire and run the army, and even calls Belisarius a cuck, which I don't think is true.
I think that's an embellishment at the very best. I think it's an embellishment, but I think it's certainly harsh judgment either which way.
And of course, Procopius, his main criticism of Belisarius isn't like his military career. It's more the fact that he believes that if there's anybody who could have deposed Justinian, it was Belisarius, and Belisarius' failure was not doing so. But again, as I've alluded, I don't agree with that assessment. I think, but the mistake was not on Belisarius betraying Justinian; it was on Justinian betraying Belisarius.
Yeah, but I mean, it's just sort of funny that we've kind of painted this idea of, you know, Belisarius, the exarch of Italy, and it isn't without well, I want to say precedent. Obviously, it's our precedent, not Belisarius's precedent. But if you look forward to probably the next most successful commander in Italy, probably the one with some of the a relatively unknown figure, but probably with one of the better combat records following Justinian and the period of Nazis and sort of this era, would be one. Is it Georgios Maniakes, who was a catapanate of Italy and Langobardia in the 9th century. Like, I think it was about half a century prior to Manzikert. So you're talking like early 10s something, right? Like 1030s or something like that. And he actually leads the almost total recapture of Sicily from the you know, the Arabs, the Muslims. Was it the Arcatid dynasty? I can't remember exactly. But anyway, largely recaptures the island, and then because of a dispute with the admiral of the navy, who was, I think, the brother-in-law of the emperor at the time, he basically packs his troops together, you know, gains control over what elements of the army, the navy, the naval task force is able to, sails to mainland Greece, engages the imperial army at Thessalonica, defeats the imperial army, but actually dies in the fight. So his coup, you know, eventually evaporates. But he's actually sort of like the anti-Belisarius, if you get what I mean. Like, he's the general who is capable, tough, courageous, you know, militaristically very adept. But after a dispute where the emperor very much dishonors him and is in fact intrigued by the court, he actually sort of uses that as the pretext to depose of an emperor. And the emperor that Maniakes rebelled against was far more incompetent than Justinian. But in some ways, like, he does represent like the anti-Belisarius in this equation, if you get my gist, Bede. And if you haven't read about him, you should. He's actually quite an intriguing figure.
What emperor did he rebel against or depose?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I'm not too sure because it's after it's after Basil II, so I'm going to assume it's like, was it?
Okay, was it?
Maybe I can't remember exactly, but
I'll
I'll just Google it
because I'm actually going to century. Okay, right. So quite late.
Yeah, because so he was born in 998 and died in 1043. So he obviously lives to like the age of 50 or so. Okay, there you go. Constantine. I said Constantine Monomachos, didn't I? Yeah, it was during his reign.
Yeah, that's Constantine the 10th, isn't? Oh, 9th. Okay, not 10th.
The 9th. Yes, because his wife was Zoe Porphyrogenitia. So, and it's kind of interesting. He does provide. Actually, I'll just put in the private chat there just so you gave him a read after the stream's done. But he's that. I just wanted to read or bring it to mention because it is very much the anti-Belisarius argument. Like, you know, what would happen if Belisarius rebelled? And were it not for him actually dying in that battle around Thessalonica, he probably would have been emperor. So he does provide that example of the counterfactual.
Oh no, certainly. But of course, I think we talked about them last time. But another comparison to, you know, these ideas of like a Byzantine soldier emperors, you've got the a lot of the co-emperors in the 10th century. You know, you've got first Romanus Lecapenus with Constantine VII, and then you've got Nicephorus the second and John Zimisces.
Yeah, exactly, and Basil II, of course.
Well, he was of the actual imperial dynasty. What I meant that these other figures were generals who
true. Oh, that's right. No, I know what you mean now. Yeah, no, married into the throne as such. Yeah, well, kind of the role that Romanus Diogenes did. You know, marrying the empress at the time after being a captive general and then marching against the Turks. Similar
exactly.
setup. Indeed. I was going to say that there is obviously a bit of an argument here that Byzantium does become something of a thoughtocracy now that you've coined the term.
Well, do you know something? One of the stream idea I've had is I'm tempted to do a stream called Byzantine Gynocracy, and just looking at all of the various kind of the streak of like female rules. So obviously, looking at obviously Theodora and Antonina and Procopius in the Secret History. Like then obviously you've got Irene and the obviously iconoclasm. Binding her own son.
Irene of Athens.
Yeah, then obviously you got Zoe, and it's her sister.
Yeah, Carbonopsina, the Colide, yeah.
I mean, that period where you've got Zoe and it's like her sister, that you've got the two elderly spinster empresses co-ruling together. It's like the absolute
like marrying the generals of the court. Yeah, exactly. I was going to say, we could, like, if you'd like really use the Greek terminology, you could like gynokratia, you know? Gynokratia Byzantia, to use the Greek sort of phraseology. Anyway, we digress.
Well, I hope everybody's enjoyed this finishing up of this conversation on Belisarius. I agree with the assessment. I think he was Byzantium's Africanus in many ways more than one. So if people have got any final questions, now's your time to send them. Is there anything you'd like to shill, Marcus, before we get out of here?
Not so much to shill, but can I just sort of, I suppose, bookmark this? There's a bit I want to say about Belisarius just before we end. And actually just to give people, if anyone wants to super chat, just some time to formulate their questions. Do you mind if I just give my 2 cents?
Sure.
It's probably more 5 cents, but anyway, I'll try and give it brief. Just to sort of, I suppose, reflect on the idea of Byzantium's Africanus, I definitely think is the most analogous of the sort of East Roman generals to resemble Africanus. I think it's worth saying that I think Scipio's victories were more long-lasting. They were more enduring. They had a greater impact on both Rome's history and world history. You got to think eventually Scipio and his military successors firstly ensure the survival of Republican Rome and allows it to become the power that it does. Which you got to think, we still live amongst the reverberations today. It's why we have, the nations of, the Romance-speaking countries, Italy and France and Spain and Portugal, Romania, and then like those descended countries, you got to think, France and Spain, and to a much lesser degree, Italy had colonial empires, and indeed their populations distributed far around the world and carried that culture, from everywhere. You guys know I'm Australian. I live here. There's a very large Italian population or Italian descended population in Australia. There's a lot of Italians in Argentina and Brazil. There's a lot of Spaniards all through South and Central America, and indeed even in the United States. That sort of a lot of that culture has its origins in Rome. And basically, if Scipio fails, none of that happens. If you get my meaning, the thrones of of Castile don't exist. Modern France doesn't exist. There is basically no sort of Roman Latin-speaking empire. And indeed, do you get the synthesis between Greece and Rome that produces Byzantium and produces this sort of East Roman civilization around Constantinople and Anatolia? No, none of that transpires. There's no Roman Macedonian War. Rome never comes into contact with Antiochus and the Seleucids. And, what would have happened in the East? What would have happened to the successor states? Like the butterfly effect is monumental. So Scipio winning and defeating the Carthaginians and eventually defeating Hannibal at Zama have immense reverberations. Sadly, Belisarius's victories don't have quite the same consequences. Obviously it's close to us in time, so there's less scope for that to happen. But it's not as if, like for example, if Belisarius had lived in the era of Muhammad and defeated them at Yarmouk, we're talking about something that massively transforms global history. Belisarius doesn't do that. But I think it's fair to say that Scipio had more resources of the state at his hands than what Scipio did. And even though Scipio himself was party to intrigues of the Roman Senate, if you could call that the court, they were not nearly as egregious as the ones that were faced by Belisarius in Constantinople. And because Belisarius served an emperor rather than a senate, rather than an aristocracy, It was very easy for his reputation to be poisoned by someone like Theodora, who could then drip feed essentially nonsense to Justinian and earn the ire of the one man who had absolute power in the empire. And so this is probably not entirely, but a large reason why Belisarius is almost always hamstrung and almost always forced to fight with one hand tied behind his back. Whereas if you look at Scipio, Scipio had a number of legions fighting with him in Spain. Yes, he recruited more, but Scipio almost always had the means to be able to prosecute a lasting war. In the end, he possesses and attains the resources to be able to invade mainland Africa and take the fight to Carthage and defeat Hannibal's armies outside of Carthage on the plains of Zama. I mean, in the end, Scipio has the ability to field, several legions in that battle and the battles leading up to it. Belisarius never has these resources, and yet, despite the hamstrung resources, he still accomplishes much. But I think we have to sort of say that with less, he achieved less. His successes had far less reverberations through history. But that put aside, he's certainly the most analogous general to Scipio from a post-Roman imperial, a classical era. And also, I think he is like, there's so many people who get called last Romans in Roman history, right? Majorian, Flavius Aetius, and some even put it back as far as early as Aurelian. Some say it's Constantine, yada yada yada. But Belisarius for me is definitively the last man you can put in that position as being the last Roman. L'ultimo Romano, as the Italians would say. And sorry, go on, Bede.
Well, no, indeed, because again, he and Justinian were the last generation of people in the East who spoke Latin. So after that, it'll be Greek speakers. So it's literally, in many ways, he was the last Roman. But I think another example is you're talking about this idea of generalship. Well, after Belisarius, think about all the famous Byzantine commanders, and what you notice, they are all emperors of the leading dynasties. You don't really get a kind of really this kind of class of like successful general until the aforementioned 10th century, when you get these kind of soldier emperors like a Romanus Lecapenus or a Nicephorus II or a John Zimisces.
Not to nitpick, you get a little bit of it at the very end of the 9th century, say with the Corcus family. But again, these magnates arise out of that culture and present themselves in the 10th century. You're correct. Yes. Sorry for the nitpick, but yes, you're correct.
Yeah, exactly. So Belisarius represents the last of an old tradition of kind of, shall we say, loyal soldiers who aren't the leader, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, like a patriot soldier general that serves the emperor and the empire in a very sort of resolute and steadfast and loyal fashion, which becomes the exception rather than the rule, you might say.
Certainly. And
the other, sorry, just very quickly, just want to say about Belisarius is that, and also I think the mark of a great general is the ability to come back from defeats. And given how he was able to gain victory and succeed so much with so little, is in a way such a reflection of his astonishing capability and talent, and that should never be lost. And it's a pity that Belisarius is always underrated. People say like, oh, what's your list of your like top 5 or top 10 or top 20 generals? It is hard to put Belisarius in there, but my God, he's a worthy part of that discussion. Absolutely. And anyone who takes a cursory look at his campaigns or studies the subject with any sort of remote depth, it is plainly obvious that he's a very, very worthwhile candidate and definitely has a place in that discussion. No shadow of a doubt.
Certainly, thank you. And just one other point I want to make is obviously, as you've alluded to, the comparison between Belisarius and Scipio Africanus isn't perfect, but I see myself largely operating in the spirit of someone like Plutarch in his parallel lives, because even he acknowledges in his comparisons that these aren't perfect, but that as you say, Marcus, history doesn't repeat itself, but it very often rhymes, and I'm seeing a lot of rhyming going on between Africanus and Belisarius.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Like, it is very true. Like, as much as they are different people and have different stories and endure different things, like, they are very comparable people. Like, that is absolutely undeniable.
Certainly. And we've had some more super chats come in. So Richard Hughes for another £20. Thank you for your streams more together, please. Well, I would like to, but I think the time zone and other occupations have sort of been an obstacle to that, sadly.
Yeah, let me admit, it's much more my fault than Bede's, but I will endeavour to do my utmost to do more of these, because I mean, I can't speak for Bede, but I certainly enjoy them, and I hope you guys enjoy them too. And Bede, much to his credit, is very tolerating of my IRL commitments and my time difference. So thank you, Bede, and I do apologise. And as you know, from the very first stream we ever did together, which was that Fuller and the analysis of Fuller's book. Was that the first stream we did together?
Yeah, the conduct of war, yeah.
Yeah, and I've enjoyed everyone since. So most certainly, it's not that. I mean, and as you guys know, this topic's my bread and butter, so I very much enjoy it. But yeah, like I said, that Richard Hughes, blame me, not Bede. It is not remotely his fault. It is all mine.
And Rong Tao Wu gifted 5 channel memberships. So yeah, enjoy
hey,
those.
bravo!
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how much that is, but that's got to be a fair amount of money. 5 memberships, so it's probably like £15, I imagine.
Still, every little bit counts, and every little bit of generosity is much appreciated. So on Bede's behalf, thank you.
I know I'm not complaining. It's just that I've got 2 different membership ranks, so I'm not sure whether it's just one or it's $24 according to him. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Rong Tao Wu. Well, I won't lie. This I think this might be my best stream in terms of money I've made this year, actually. Considering everything.
Oh, really? Oh, wow.
Yeah, I might have to check after a few days it's all processed. It will tell me how much my revenue I've made from this. So, but yeah, it could be. But thank you, everybody, your support. It's much appreciated. So, well, this is nothing you want to show, Marcus, or?
Got a couple of things that are sort of quote unquote planned. It's still a bit uncertain yet where I go, because I've got a bit of a truncated sort of end to my year. And you guys have probably seen all going well. Speaking with Tan this year, so that'll be lovely. But in terms of streams, yeah, I've still it's actually funny. I was only talking to him yesterday. I'm well overdue to actually stream with Auron. We've been bubbling on a couple of questions, but I haven't quite got around to settling on what to do with him yet. So there's that. And then I know Iron Duke's watching, so yes, Iron Duke, I know we have long planned to do a stream about Caesar and Caesar's campaign, so that's in the works. But yeah, now that I've sort of like more or less completed my relocation, I can actually get back to reading now, because I've got, I mean, you know what it's like, Bede, when you run a history channel. I mean, I don't run a history channel, but obviously do a lot of stuff with all you guys. When you got a backlog of like, oh, I have like 5 books in my to-read list, and then that book list grows to 10, and then it's 20, and you find it hard to catch up again. But we'll get there in the end. It's all good. And indeed, you know, if you've got anything in the pipeline or any ideas you'd like to carry forth, Bede, you know, I'm always one to be receptive. So, you know, we'll see what we do going forward.
Oh, no, certainly. Your presence is always appreciated, Marcus, and it's always good to talk to you. And we've had another super chat, Marcos 588 for 2.9 Australian dollars. Thanks, gents. Well, thank you, Marcos 588.
I'm not the only one burning the midnight oil. Thank you.
What I'll also say is, obviously, if you're somebody who's just become a member because of Ron Chalwu's generosity, I have many streams behind the paywall, so use your membership to enjoy that while you can.
Splendid.
So in terms of this, including some done with you, Marcus, including our discussion on Caesar.
Indeed. Well, I was going to say maybe we can do a cooperative effort. You know, that might be worth considering.
No, sure.
Yeah,
absolutely. Right. So in terms of this channel, in a couple of weeks, I'll be doing the next episode of my series on modern Iran. Hunger is back from his travels, and so we'll be delving into the nadir of the Pahlavi dynasty and the Iranian Revolution. Of course, if you're more interested in more Roman history, last week I did do a stream reflecting on the Nerva Antonii and the 5 good emperors and their sort of historical reputation and legacy. And of course, I've always got other ideas I'm cooking up, so stay tuned for those as well. So thank you everybody for watching.
I was gonna.
So yeah.
So just briefly for me, I was going to say, and another topic that would be worth, because it usually gets mentioned in between topics or as like a part of a great discussion. But just because you mentioned the 5 good emperors, it just jolted my thought. You know, it might actually be good to like do like perhaps a mini stream on quite strictly the Tetrarchy, because often the Tetrarchy's sort of spoken in the context of the greater Third World crisis of the 3rd century, or as like the prelude to Constantine. It'd actually be kind of good just to do a stream on the Tetrarchy itself and the personalities within the Tetrarchy. I'm not saying that you ought to do it or whatever, but not a bad idea. Like, I find the Tetrarchy such a really interesting period of history that is quite often neglected.
No, I mean, I'm certainly open to that. I mean, I find Diocletian fascinating, so no, I'm completely open to that.
Well, wrong. Tao Wu says yes. There we go. Ring endorsement from our friend. No, all good, Pete. Anyway, I'll let you to it. I'll let you close out the show. But thank you, everyone, and God bless, and thank you.
Well, thank you everybody for watching, and enjoy the rest of your weekend. Bye bye.